A deputy. A blizzard. A cruiser pushed off a cliff. No skid marks, no witnesses, no survivors. That was the plan. But someone forgot about the man who lives where the roads end. A man who stopped trusting the world years ago. A man who has seen what happens when power wears a badge and calls murder an accident. The snow was supposed to bury everything. It buried nothing. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if it grabs you in the first 5 minutes, it will. Smash that like button so the next story finds even more people who need to hear it. Now, let's go. The Frostfang Mountains did not forgive. That was the first thing anyone learned who came here, not as a tourist, not passing through on the state route, but actually came here, boots in the dirt, lungs burning in the altitude. The range had a way of measuring people, of finding the cracks in them. The cold got into everything, into wood, into metal, into the space between a man's ribs where confidence used to live. And the winters, God, the winters, were not weather events. They were verdicts. This particular December had delivered one of the worst in 40 years. The National Weather Service had issued its blizzard warning 6 days earlier. 60-mile-per-hour gusts, visibility under 100 feet, snowfall accumulation that would make the mountain roads not just dangerous but invisible, erased, like chalk drawings in the rain. Every sheriff's department in a 4-county radius had pulled their units back to paved ground. Sensible. Professional. By the book. But Deputy Lena Brooks had driven into it anyway. That detail would matter later. That detail was, in fact, the only detail that mattered at all. Elias Mercer woke at 0430, the way he always woke. Not gradually, not reluctantly, but completely. One moment he was under, and then he wasn't. No alarm, no transition, just the sudden hard fact of being awake, the way a light switch works. He lay still for 3 seconds, the old habit. Listen first, move second. His eyes traced the ceiling of the timber cabin, rough-cut pine beams, dark with age, a spiderweb in the corner that he'd been meaning to knock down for 2 years. Outside, the wind was howling in registers that would have terrified most people. To Elias, it was just weather. He'd slept through worse in places whose names he wasn't legally permitted to discuss. He sat up. The cabin was cold. Not dangerously cold. The wood stove had held through the night, but cold enough that his breath fogged in the air when he exhaled. He was 41 years old, 6'2", built the way men get built when physical fitness stops being a goal and becomes something closer to a nervous habit. His left shoulder carried a deep surgical scar that ached when the barometric pressure dropped. It was aching now. He pulled on thermal layers. Wool socks. The heavy flannel shirt with the fraying cuffs he'd told himself he'd replaced 3 winters ago. Then the insulated vest. Ghost was already standing by the door. The dog was a German shepherd, 7 years old, 78 pounds, with a black and sable coat that had gone slightly silver at the muzzle. Elias had gotten him from a military working dog program when Ghost had been honorably retired after 4 combat deployments, a fact that Elias considered deeply relatable. The dog looked up at him now, with those pale amber eyes that always seemed to be doing math. "I know," Elias said. "Give me a minute." He pulled on his boots, laced them, stood. The morning ritual was simple: fire check, water, coffee, radio. In that order. He stoked the wood stove, added 2 splits of pine, listened to the creak and pop of the fire finding its stride. Filled the kettle from the water tank. He kept it topped off religiously, one of a dozen habits that had nothing to do with paranoia and everything to do with having once gone 36 hours without water in a desert that was trying to kill him. The kettle went on the stove. The radio was an AN PRC 117G, a military satellite communications unit, encrypted, ruggedized, the kind of equipment that was worth more than most civilian vehicles. He had no business owning one. He owned one. He turned it on every morning to check frequencies, not because he expected to transmit anything, but because monitoring was a different kind of silence. It told you what the world's noise level was, gave you a baseline. This morning, the military frequencies were quiet. The civilian emergency bands were cluttered with weather advisories and road closure confirmations. Nothing unusual. He turned it off. The coffee was ready. He poured it black into a ceramic mug that said Navy across the side in letters that were almost completely faded. He sat at the table by the window and looked out at the dark, at the nothing, at the blizzard pressing its face against the glass like something that wanted to get in. Ghost sat beside him, not touching him, but close enough that their warmth overlapped slightly. "Just another morning," Elias said. Ghost didn't agree or disagree, just kept looking out the window. The smoke appeared at 0612. Ghost saw it first, or smelled it. Elias was never entirely sure which sense the dog prioritized, and Ghost wasn't explaining. What happened was, the dog went rigid. Every muscle in that long body locked simultaneously, ears swiveling forward, nose working in short, rapid pulses. His tail didn't wag. His tail was perfectly still, which was more alarming than growling. Elias set down the mug. He looked where Ghost was looking. Through the window, through the gray pre-dawn murk, and the curtain of falling snow. There was a thin vertical line of black smoke rising from somewhere down the slope. Maybe half a mile, maybe less. It was the wrong color for a campfire, too dark, too oily. It was the color of synthetic materials burning, rubber, plastic, something manufactured. Elias stood. He crossed to the wall rack and pulled down his cold weather gear without hurrying, without rushing, the way you move when you've learned that panic is just wasted energy. Insulated bibs, layered jacket, balaclava, goggles. He pulled a pack from under the cot. It was always half assembled, another habit, and added the trauma kit, a chemical heat pack, paracord, a handheld radio, and the fixed blade knife he'd carried since Fallujah. He didn't take the rifle. He thought about it, then decided that if this was what he thought it was, a rifle would be the wrong tool. And if it was something else, he'd improvise. "Come on," he said to Ghost. The dog went through the door first. The world outside was violence made meteorological. Wind hit him like a physical thing, a wall that pushed back against every step. The snow was coming horizontal, ice crystals rather than flakes, stinging any exposed skin. Visibility was maybe 60 feet in any direction. He could lose himself in this storm, lose the cabin, lose every landmark. He'd seen it happen to experienced outdoorsmen who thought they knew these slopes. He oriented on the smoke, moved downhill, let Ghost lead. The dog moved with certainty. Head low, body angled into the wind, picking a line through the drifts with the efficiency of something that had been designed by several million years of evolution to do exactly this. Elias followed 3 steps behind, reading the terrain the way he'd been trained to read terrain. Exits, elevations, cover, lines of approach. The smell hit him before the visual. Burning metal, burning rubber, burning something, hot and chemical and wrong in the clean mountain air. Then the tree line broke, and he saw it. The sheriff's cruiser had come off the ridge road at speed and gone down a 40-foot drop, nose first, into the ravine. The vehicle had hit the rocky slope hard enough to compress the front third of the frame, hard enough to shatter the windshield and deploy every airbag. It lay on its roof, driver's side down, engine still burning in a low, hungry way that would consume the whole vehicle within the hour. Elias stood at the lip of the ravine and took it in without moving. 5 seconds. 10. Read the scene before you enter the scene. No skid marks on the ridge road above. The snow had been falling for 6 hours, which would cover most evidence, but skid marks leave physical displacement, tire channels, disturbed gravel, broken guardrail. There was no broken guardrail. The guardrail on the ridge road was intact for the full visible length in both directions. Whatever had happened here, the cruiser had not slid through a barrier. It had gone over the edge cleanly, at a point where there was no barrier at all. A gap in the railing. A deliberate gap. Or a gap that someone had known about. Someone. He filed that. He'd think about it later. Right now, was anyone alive? Ghost was already at the bottom of the ravine, having found a descent angle that Elias hadn't seen yet. The dog was circling the wreckage, nose down, tail working in short, urgent arcs. Not alert, seeking. "Find," Elias said, though the dog didn't need the instruction. Ghost moved 20 feet from the wreck and stopped. Looked back. Looked down. What? She was halfway down the slope below the wreck, half buried in snow, fingers dug into the frozen dirt as though she'd clawed her way to this position from somewhere even further down. She was in a sheriff's department uniform, tan and brown, the Frostfang County colors, with a duty jacket that had torn along the left shoulder. Her face was turned sideways, one cheek pressed against the snow, eyes partially open in the way eyes get when a person is fighting very hard not to close them. Elias was beside her in seconds, trauma kit already in hand. "Hey!" He kept his voice level. Not gentle, not harsh. Level. Commanding, the way a voice needs to be when someone is going under and needs an anchor. "Stay with me. You hear me? Open your eyes." Her eyes moved, found his. There was cognition there, dim, struggling, but present. "I'm going to check you," he said. "Don't move." He ran his hands along her spine first, a field spinal assessment, imprecise but better than nothing. No obvious deformity. No screaming in response to pressure on the vertebral processes. He moved to her ribs, gentle pressure, and she hissed through clenched teeth when he reached the left side. "Broken ribs," he said. It wasn't a question. 3, she managed. Her voice was rough, barely audible over the wind. "Maybe 4. I already counted." "You counted your own broken ribs?" "Had to know. Whether the lung was compromised." Elias paused, looked at her more carefully. "You've got medical training. Academy." A breath. A careful, shallow breath. "And my dad was he was a paramedic." "All right, is your lung compromised?" "Don't think so. I can expand both sides. Painful, but equal." "Good. Don't move your head." I was already applying a cervical collar from the kit, doing it efficiently, without unnecessary explanation. "Can you feel your feet?" "Yes." A pause. "They hurt." "That's probably good." "It's definitely good." He secured the collar. "I'm Elias." "What's your name?" "Brooks. Lena Brooks. Deputy." She stopped. Something moved across her face. Something that wasn't physical pain. "Deputy, Frostfang County." "Okay, Deputy Brooks, I'm going to move you. It's going to hurt. You need to let it hurt without fighting me, because fighting me is going to make the injuries worse. Do you understand?" Her jaw tightened. "I understand." "Tell me before you pass out." "I'm not going to pass. Tell me before you pass out." A beat. "Okay?" He wrapped her, lifted her. She made a sound that she clearly hadn't planned to make. A short, bitten-off noise somewhere between a gasp and a curse. He moved up the slope with her in a modified carry, one arm under her knees, one across her back, keeping his center of gravity low against the incline. Ghost moved ahead of them, breaking trail. They were 30 feet from the wreck when she turned her head slightly and said something so quietly he almost missed it. He stopped. "Say that again." Her eyes found his. Clearer now, somehow. The cold and the pain burning through whatever shock had been blurring her. "They pushed my cruiser," she said. The return trip to the cabin took 40 minutes. Under normal conditions, on clear ground, it would have been 10. But normal conditions had stopped applying to this morning approximately an hour ago, and Elias had learned long before today that survival math was nothing like classroom math. Every additional variable multiplied the difficulty exponentially. Injured civilian, double the time. Blizzard conditions, double again. Declining visibility, factor in the cost of navigational errors. He talked to her the whole way. Not because she needed conversation, because he needed to monitor her consciousness level, and continuous verbal engagement was the fastest way to track cognitive function in a field environment. You ask questions. You watch the quality of the answers. The moment the answers start trailing off, slurring, or simply stopping, that's when you're losing someone. "How long were you in the ravine?" he asked. "Don't know exactly. Maybe 2 hours? I think I was out for part of it." "What's today's date?" "December 14th. "Who's the president?" She told him, correctly. "Where's the closest hospital to Frostfang County?" "St. Catherine's in Merritt, 42 miles south on Route 9. A pause. "Which is closed right now because of the storm, so one problem at a time." She almost laughed. It came out as a short, painful exhale. "You're not exactly comforting." "I'm not trying to comfort you. I'm trying to keep you alive. They're different jobs." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who are you?" "I told you, Elias." "Elias who lives in a cabin in the middle of a blizzard with a dog." "That's accurate, yes." "Are you—" She trailed off, started again. "Are you alone up here?" "Yes." "By choice?" He didn't answer immediately. The cabin appeared through the snow, a dark rectangle of warmth against the white, and he focused on the last 100 feet, watching his footing on the slope. By choice, he said finally. Long. Inside, he moved with the compressed efficiency of someone who had set up field aid stations in conditions that made this cabin look like an operating theater. He got her onto the cot, got the fire stoked, got her wet outer layers off without moving her spine more than necessary, while she did her best to help and mostly succeeded. He assessed her again properly, slower this time, more thorough, in the light. 3 broken ribs, left side, no penetration. A deep laceration along her left temple, scalp wounds bleeding spectacularly the way scalp wounds always did, looking far worse than they were. Right wrist swollen but not fractured. She'd held it up when she hit something and caught the impact with the carpals rather than the radius, which was either smart or lucky, or both. First-degree frostbite on the tips of 3 fingers. Contusions across her shoulders and hips from the airbag and the tumble down the slope. No spinal injury, no pneumothorax, no signs of internal bleeding, which was the one he'd been most worried about. She was going to be in extraordinary pain for the next several weeks. She was not going to die today. "You're banged up," he said, "but you're solid." High praise. "In my experience, it is." He began cleaning the temple laceration. "Tell me about the cruiser." She didn't answer right away. He felt her go still under his hands, not the stillness of someone losing consciousness, but the stillness of someone making a decision. "I was on a patrol route," she said. "Ridge Road 7. It's technically in my coverage area, but nobody uses it in winter. I was the only unit who ever logged it in the last 2 years. I checked the records." "Why check the records?" "Because I was trying to figure out why someone had bothered maintaining it." He paused his work, looked at her. "Maintained by who?" "County road crew. But the work orders were off, wrong billing codes, wrong labor hours, wrong equipment. I flagged it to my sergeant 3 months ago." She met his eyes. "He told me I was misreading the paperwork." "Were you?" "No." He went back to the laceration. "What were those roads being used for?" Lena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped. Not from pain, but from something closer to the weight of what she was about to say. "Movement," she said. "Weapons. Military-grade hardware, not hunting rifles, not civilian arms. We're talking about crated equipment, suppressors, modified receivers, components that have no legal pathway to private ownership." She exhaled carefully. "Transported on those roads under county protection. Sheriff's vehicles running interference, running escort." The fire popped. Wind hit the cabin wall. "How long?" Elias asked. "I think at least 4 years, maybe longer." She paused. "The money is, I found transaction records that—" She stopped, recalibrated. "A lot of money, Elias. Enough money that it explains a lot of things that never made sense. New equipment, new vehicles, budget overruns that nobody questioned because the sheriff's approval rating in this county is—" "Sheriff Harlan Voss," Elias said. She went still again. "I've been up here 4 years," he said. "I don't talk to people much, but I watch the roads. I notice patterns. Voss runs this county like it's his personal property." "He's run it for 11 years, Lena said quietly. 3-time county sheriff. 4th-generation law enforcement family. His father's name is on the courthouse." She looked at the ceiling. "He's not just the most powerful man in Frostfang County. He might be the most protected. He has relationships with the state legislature, with the AG's office, with the people who would normally investigate him." "Yes." Ghost padded over to the cot and settled at Lena's feet, heavy and warm. She looked down at him with something that might have been gratitude. "The evidence," Elias said. "I didn't have it on me. I knew—" She stopped, breathed. "I knew that if I was carrying it and something happened to me, it would disappear. Same as the records I tried to copy from the department server. They were gone within 48 hours. Someone sanitized them remotely. Someone inside the department. At minimum, 2 someones, possibly more." She looked at him directly. "I put it somewhere safe." "Where?" She was quiet for a beat too long. "Lena." "There's an abandoned ranger station," she said. "Station 4, up near the Blackthorn Pass trailhead. Nobody's used it operationally in 7 years. I checked the Forestry Service records. I hiked up there 2 weeks ago. She paused. I had an old K9 unit collar. One of the retired dogs. The lining is thick, padded. You can open a seam and reseal it without it showing. Memory card, he said. Micro SD, 14 gigabytes. She almost smiled. Financial records, communications, transport schedules, recordings. 6 recordings. Including... She stopped. Including what? Including one recording of Sheriff Voss explaining to someone over a secure line why a particular state investigator needed to have an accident. She paused. The investigator had a car accident 6 months later. He survived. He doesn't remember anything. The wind hit the cabin again, hard. The window rattled. The card is safe, Elias said. And you're not going to tell me exactly where in the station. Not yet. Her eyes were steady on his. No offense. None taken. He meant it. Smart. He stood up from the cot and moved to the radio table. He looked at the ANPRC 1710G for a moment without touching it. He hadn't transmitted on a military frequency in 3 years, 2 months, and approximately 11 days. Not that he'd been counting. Is that a military satellite radio? Lena asked from the cot. Yes. Can it reach? It can reach anyone on the planet who's listening on the right frequency. He looked at her. But once I key up, we're announcing position. Military satellite traffic gets logged. It will eventually get attention from people who will eventually ask questions about who is transmitting from these coordinates. And you don't want that. I've been keeping a low profile. She watched him. Something shifted in her expression. Low profile from what? He didn't answer. She didn't push. Ghost suddenly came off the floor. The dog moved to the cabin door in one fluid motion and stood there, head up, body taut, ears forward, not growling, not barking, something quieter and more serious than either. Elias crossed to the window, stood to the side of the frame, never in front of a window, never silhouetted, and looked out into the white. Nothing visible. Just snow and dark trees and the shifting curtain of the storm. But Ghost didn't move from the door. And Elias had learned, over 7 years, to trust the dog's nose over his own eyes. He turned back to the room. His voice dropped. How did they know which road you were taking this morning? Lena looked at him. Then she looked at her duty jacket. Then she looked back at him. Her face had gone pale with something that had nothing to do with blood loss. My patrol log, she said. It auto-syncs to the department server. Every 45 minutes. GPS coordinates, route, timestamp. Who has access to that server? She closed her eyes. Everyone, she said. Everyone with a department log in. Ghost pressed his nose to the gap at the bottom of the door and drew in a long, slow breath. And then, barely audible, beneath the scream of the storm, Elias heard it. The creak of a footstep in the snow, 40 feet from the cabin. Maybe 30. Moving carefully. Moving like someone who didn't want to be heard. Elias didn't move from the window. He stood to the side of the frame, shoulder pressed against the log wall, and counted. 1 footstep. Then silence. Then another. The spacing was deliberate, not the random crunch of an animal, not the stumbling gait of a lost hiker. Whoever was out there was moving in a controlled interval pattern, pausing between steps to listen. Trained movement. He crossed to the cot in 4 steps and crouched to Lena's level. His voice was barely above the sound of the fire. How many people knew you were running that route this morning? She thought about it. He could see her working through it, fighting through the pain and the medication fog from the ibuprofen he'd given her. My sergeant logged it. Dispatch would have it. The duty commander. She stopped. Anyone monitoring the server in real time? So not a small list. No. Okay. He stood. I need you to do something uncomfortable. I'm already doing something uncomfortable. It's called existing right now. I need you to get off the cot and onto the floor, behind it. The cot frame is solid pine. It's not cover, but it's concealment, and right now concealment is what we have. She looked at him. Then she looked at the cot. Then, without arguing, she began to move. He helped her. She bit down hard on whatever sound wanted to come out when her ribs shifted, got her onto the floor, back against the wall, the cot frame between her and the windows. Ghost settled in immediately beside her. Not trained to do that, just doing it, the dog's mass warm and solid against her side. Elias pulled the heavy wool blanket off the cot and covered them both. From the window line, in the dim interior light, they would be invisible. He straightened up, moved to the door. The footsteps had stopped. That was worse. He didn't open the door. He went to the small side window in the kitchen area. 4 inches of opening, a ventilation gap he kept cracked in all weather because the wood stove ate oxygen, and a closed cabin with a hot stove was a slow suffocation problem. He pressed his eye to the gap. One figure. Tree line, 25 yards out. Standing completely still, which was how he'd missed it initially. The human eye tracks movement, not stillness, and whoever this was understood that. Dark clothing. No high-vis gear, no reflective patches. In a blizzard. At dawn. Nobody doing anything legitimate wore dark clothing in a blizzard at dawn. He watched the figure for 90 seconds without blinking. The figure didn't move, just stood there with the patience of someone who was either very cold and very lost, or very professional and very deliberate. One hand was at the figure's side. The other was held slightly away from the body, near the hip, near where a holster sits. Elias pulled back from the window. He went to the wall cabinet. Top shelf. Behind the emergency medical supplies. He kept a Glock 19 there. 15 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, no safety to think about in a stress situation. He'd owned it for 4 years and fired it at paper targets exactly twice. He'd always hoped that record would stand. He checked the chamber by touch without looking at it, then moved the pistol to his waistband at the small of his back. Then he put on his boots and his jacket. "What are you doing?" Lena said from behind the cot. Her voice was low, controlled, but tight with something she was working to keep out of it. "Going to have a conversation." Elias, 1 person, 25 yards tree line. If there were more, they'd have moved already. Multiple people can't hold static positions in this cold for long without some of them shifting. He pulled on his gloves. 1 person is either a scout or someone who got separated from a group. Either way, I need to know which. And if it's a scout? Then the group knows where I am and they were coming here regardless. So going out and controlling the meeting point is better than waiting in here and letting them choose the geometry. She was quiet for a moment. "You talk about this like it's just math," she said. "It is just math." He paused at the door. "Keep Ghost quiet if you can. He'll want to follow me out." "How do I—" "Put your hand on the back of his neck. Firm, flat pressure. He'll stay." He opened the door before she could say anything else and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall he'd forgotten was there. In the cabin, even thinking about the temperature outside, the body protects itself with the idea of warmth. Then you step out, and the idea gets stripped away instantly, and you're left with the raw arithmetic of -14 Fahrenheit and a 40-mile-per-hour wind and the snow that comes at you sideways and finds every gap in your clothing within the first 10 seconds. Elias ignored it, not because he didn't feel it, but because the cold was information, not a problem. It told him how long someone could maintain a static position in this weather before their fine motor skills started degrading. It told him the window of operational effectiveness for people who weren't acclimatized to altitude cold. He walked toward the tree line, not at the spot where he'd seen the figure, 40 feet to the left of it, along a natural depression in the snow that gave him lower visual profile. He moved in a crouch, using the terrain, the way you do when terrain is the only cover available. He came up on the figure's left flank, close enough to see clearly now. Male, average height, dark tactical jacket, the kind sold in any outdoors surplus store, deliberately non-military. Wool balaclava, goggles pushed up on the forehead. He was holding a compact radio in his left hand, and his right hand was resting on the grip of a pistol in a hip holster. He was watching the cabin door. He hadn't heard Elias at all. Elias moved to within 8 feet before he spoke. "Put the radio on the ground." The man spun. Fast. Genuine reflexes, the spin of someone with training. His right hand came off the holster and started moving upward in a draw motion before Elias's voice had even finished registering. But Elias was already inside the arm's reach, his left hand catching the drawing wrist, redirecting momentum rather than fighting it, and using the man's own rotational energy to drive his back against the nearest tree. The impact was solid and purposeful, and not gentle. The radio went into the snow. The pistol didn't clear the holster. Elias had his forearm across the man's throat. Not crushing. Enough to communicate that crushing was an option. The man went still. He was smart enough for that, at least. "Deep breath," Elias said. Use your nose. The man breathed through his nose. His eyes were doing the rapid calculation of someone who had just realized they'd dramatically misjudged the situation. Who sent you? Elias said. Nothing. Elias increased the forearm pressure slightly, not enough to damage the trachea, enough to make the next breath noticeably harder. I don't have a lot of patience for this, Elias said, and you're burning my morning. Who sent you? Search and rescue, the man said. His voice was strained. We got a report of a… No. Elias stepped back, just enough. Kept the man against the tree with presence rather than contact. The way you keep a cornered animal in place, through stillness and eye contact. Search and rescue wears high-vis gear in blizzard conditions because the primary risk in winter SAR operations is your own team losing sight of you. You're wearing flat black. Search and rescue announces approach to structures. They call out. They don't creep up on houses in the dark. And search and rescue doesn't draw on civilians during a welfare check. The man said nothing. One more time, Elias said. Who sent you? The man's jaw tightened under the balaclava. His eyes did something, a quick flicker, not toward Elias, but past him. To the left. A micro-expression that most people would miss. Elias didn't miss it. He threw himself sideways a half-second before the second man came out of the trees to his left. The second man was bigger, and he'd been close, 10 feet, maybe less. He swung something in the low light, and Elias felt it pass through the air where his head had been with the specific sound of something dense and fast. A baton. Collapsible, the tactical kind. Elias hit the snow on his shoulder, rolled, came up. The first man was going for his holster again. Elias made a decision in the time it takes to decide, which is no time at all. He crossed the distance to the bigger man in 2 strides and drove an elbow into the solar plexus before the baton could complete its arc for a second swing. The big man folded. Not down, but enough. Elias grabbed the baton wrist, stripped it with a simple joint compliance technique that he'd practiced so many times in his life. It had stopped feeling like technique and just felt like physics, and now he had the baton. The first man had the pistol out. Stop, the man said. He had his breath back. The pistol was leveled, two-handed, at Elias's chest, 12 feet of distance between them. Put it down. Put the baton down, and put your hands up, and this doesn't have to go any further than it's already gone. Elias looked at him. Then he looked at the man bent over in the snow, gasping. Then he looked back at the gun. He set the baton down. Good, the man said. Now, you're going to tell me you want to search the cabin, Elias said, and I'm going to tell you no. And then we're going to have a longer conversation about where this is actually going. A beat. We have reason to believe there's a missing county deputy. She's not missing, Elias said. She's injured, she's receiving care, and you're not going anywhere near her. The man's eyes narrowed. Sir, obstruction of a law enforcement operation? Show me your badge. Silence. Show me your badge, your department ID, your commission card. Any one of the 3 standard forms of law enforcement identification that every sworn officer in this state is required to carry. Show me any of them, and I'll talk to you like a professional. The pistol didn't waver, but something behind the man's eyes did. Last chance, the man said. You already used your last chance, Elias said. Back there when you drew on an unarmed civilian in his own yard. That's a felony, depending on how the DA wants to frame it. So now you're not in a negotiating position. You're in a decision position. And the decision is whether you want to take the next step, which has consequences that you have not fully thought through. The big man was straightening up. He'd recovered enough to be mobile, and he was positioning himself to the left, trying to get an angle, trying to create a crossfire problem. Elias clocked it without looking directly at it. Don't, he said. Not loud, just certain. The big man stopped. The one with the pistol looked at his partner. Something passed between them. The rapid, silent communication of people who have worked together long enough to have a shared language of glances. Then the man with the pistol lowered it 2 inches. Not holstered, lowered. We'll be back, he said. I know, Elias said. They moved back into the tree line. He watched them until the storm swallowed them, which took about 15 seconds. Then he stood in the snow for another full minute, breathing steadily, listening to the wind and the creak of the pines and the complete absence of any other sound. His hands were steady. They were always steady. He'd never understood people who thought hands shaking after violence was a sign of weakness. It was just the body's accounting system, tallying the adrenaline expenditure. His body had a different accounting system, one that had been recalibrated over 15 years of situations where shaking hands got people killed. He bent down and picked up the radio the first man had dropped. It was a Motorola APX, mid-range encrypted law enforcement model. Standard issue for most county departments in this region. He turned it over. The battery cover had a small strip of black electrical tape across it, and under the tape, barely visible, scratched into the plastic with something sharp, were two letters. FC Frostfang County. He pocketed the radio and went back inside. Lena was still on the floor behind the cot. Ghost was pressed against her, and she had one hand buried in the fur at the back of his neck the way Elias had told her, though her grip had gone tight and white-knuckled. She looked up when he came through the door. "Two of them," he said, before she could ask. "They're gone for now." "For now," she repeated. "They'll make a report. Then someone will make a decision about next steps." He peeled off his outer jacket and hung it. His hands were starting to re-warm, and the shoulder was aching where the cold had gotten into the surgical scar. "Help me understand the chain of command here. Voss is county sheriff. Who does he answer to in a direct operational sense?" Lena let Ghost go and leaned her head back against the wall. She looked exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical injuries. The exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a secret that was too heavy for one person for too long. "In theory, the county board of supervisors? In practice?" She shook her head. "He's built relationships with the state police liaison office, the regional AG coordinator, and two sitting state senators. If you tried to make a complaint about something Voss's department did, there's a reasonable chance it would land on a desk within his circle of influence before it landed anywhere else." "What about federal?" "FBI field office is in Aldgate, 160 miles. She paused. "I did make one call. To the FBI tip line. 3 weeks ago. And I got a case number and an automated acknowledgement email." She looked at him. "Which is either standard processing time or means someone flagged the tip before it got assigned to an agent. You can't tell which." "No." He pulled a chair to the table and sat. The Motorola radio sat in front of him. He looked at it without touching it. "2 men in the field at dawn in a blizzard," he said. "That's not a search and rescue deployment. That's not even a welfare check. That takes planning, and it takes someone making a call last night or very early this morning to position assets in this area." "They knew I was coming up here," Lena said quietly. "They knew you were coming up here, or they knew approximately where the wreck would be and set a search radius." He turned the radio over. "Either way, they moved fast, which means there's operational urgency on their side." "The recording," Lena said, "the one I mentioned, Voss and the other voice discussing the investigator." She paused. "There's also a date reference in that recording, a delivery date, for the next weapons transport." Elias looked at her. "How close is that date?" he asked. She held his gaze. 4 days, she said. The fire popped. Ghost lifted his head, ears rotated toward the door, then settled again. Just the wind. 4 days. Elias stood up and went to the ANPRC 117G. He stood in front of it the same way he'd stood in front of it earlier, looking, not touching. The machine represented something he'd walked away from with intention. It wasn't just a radio. It was a connection to a world that had chewed him up and spit him out with an open military review file and a service record with a notation that could generously be called a question mark and less generously called a stain. He'd left that world. The world had seemed fine with the arrangement. "You said there was a military misunderstanding," Lena said from the floor. He turned. She was watching him with the careful eyes of someone who was very good at reading people and had been doing it quietly this whole time. "I didn't say that." "No," she agreed. "You didn't. I inferred it from the radio, the kit, the way you move, and the way you talk to those 2 men out there like you'd had that exact conversation 100 times before in worse places." She paused. "What happened?" He looked at her for a moment. The fire, the radio, the storm outside. "An operation went wrong," he said. "People died who shouldn't have. The investigation needed someone to carry the weight of it, and I was convenient and I was already disagreeing with command about the planning, which made me look like a liability. In retrospect, even though I'd been right about the planning. Were you cleared? Not formally. He turned back to the radio. Administratively separated with a review pending. The review has been pending for 3 years. So you came here? So I came here. She was quiet for a moment. Then, if you key up on that radio, they'll log the transmission coordinates, and eventually someone will flag it because of your status. Yes. That's the risk you're weighing. That's the risk I'm weighing. She didn't tell him what to do. He appreciated that more than she probably knew. He put his hand on the radio housing. The metal was cold. He thought about the 2 men in the tree line. He thought about a delivery date 4 days from now. He thought about Lena counting her own broken ribs on an ice shelf in a blizzard because she'd decided that evidence mattered more than self-preservation. I thought about a tiny memory card in the lining of an old K9 collar buried in an abandoned ranger station in these mountains, and what it meant that it existed at all, and what it meant that someone had tried hard enough to prevent it from being found that they'd pushed a sheriff's cruiser off a cliff in a blizzard. He picked up the handset, entered the frequency. An old one, Tier 1 frequency. The kind that went to a very specific monitoring station that never slept and was staffed by people with clearances that most government employees didn't know existed. He keyed the transmit button. Shadow Actual, this is Mercer. Call sign Ironsight. Authentication follows. He gave the authentication code from memory. A 12-digit sequence he'd last used 3 years ago and had told himself he'd never use again. I have a federal corruption situation, confirmed armed elements in the field, civilian casualty, evidence of ongoing weapons trafficking under law enforcement cover. Location follows. He gave the coordinates. Then he waited. Static. Wind on the antenna feed, the hiss of the satellite band. Then a voice, calm, precise, carrying the particular flat affect of someone who had been trained out of surprise. Ironsight, copy. Authentication confirmed. Stand by for senior duty officer. Another pause. 40 seconds. Elias counted them. Mercer. A different voice. Older. He didn't recognize it, which meant either personnel rotation or someone senior enough to be brought in specifically. Situation received. We are initiating contact with federal field assets. Weather is limiting deployment options significantly. What's your assessment of immediate threat level? High, Elias said. 2 armed personnel made initial contact approximately 30 minutes ago. They withdrew, but will return with reinforcement. I have an injured civilian with critical evidentiary knowledge. Current location is defensible, but not indefinitely. Understood. Federal law enforcement notification is being processed. However, Mercer, a brief pause. Current conditions at the nearest airfield are Category 4. No rotary assets are going until the weather breaks. Elias had already calculated this. Estimated break? Med is saying 14 to 18 hours minimum. 14 to 18 hours. He looked across the cabin at Lena. She'd heard. She was watching him with those steady eyes, and she wasn't panicking, which told him something important about who she was. Understood, he said into the handset. We'll hold. Copy that. Channel stays open. Check in every 2 hours. Wilco. He set the handset down, stood with his hands on the table for a moment, looking at the wall. 14 to 18 hours. The 2 men had left 20 minutes ago. They had a radio. They would have already made their call. Someone, Voss, or whoever Voss sent these things through, was already making decisions about what came next. And what came next, given the timeline, given the 4-day delivery window, given what Lena was carrying in her memory, was not going to be 2 men with a Motorola and a collapsible baton. Talk to me about the ranger station, Elias said. Lena shifted against the wall. Pain moved across her face and she waited for it to pass before speaking. Blackthorn Pass Trailhead. The station is 300 meters north of the parking area on the Forestry Service access road. There's a main structure and a storage outbuilding. The caller is in the outbuilding, under the floor, beneath a loose board that's the second from the east wall. He memorized it the way he'd been trained to memorize things, not by repetition, but by visualization. Walking the path in his mind, laying landmarks over each other like transparencies. The trailhead, the access road, the outbuilding, the floor. Second board from the east wall. How far from here, he asked. On clear trail in good conditions? She considered. Maybe 90 minutes on foot. In blizzard conditions, with no trail visible, with potential armed personnel in the area, 3 hours minimum. Probably more. There and back, 6 to 7 hours, which ate directly into the 14 to 18-hour weather window and left no margin at all. You said you didn't want to get it yet, Lena said, because of footprints. That's still true. He turned to face her. But the calculation is changing. If they regroup and bring enough people to cover both this cabin and the station, the evidence becomes inaccessible. The window for retrieval narrows as their operational response scales up. He paused. How many people does Voss have in his orbit who would do this kind of work? He has a full department, 42 sworn officers. She said it carefully, like she was choosing each word. I don't know how many of them know what's actually happening versus how many are just following orders without full context. That's the problem. I don't know who's dirty and who's just loyal. But someone at the crash site will have confirmed the wreck by now, Elias said. Yes. And someone will have confirmed there's no body. Yes. So they know you survived. They know you're somewhere in this immediate area. He moved to the window. The tree line was still. Still in a way that could mean empty or could mean very good at being still. They'll work the radius. This cabin is the only structure within 3 miles of the crash site. They'll come here with more people and a better plan, and they'll use the law enforcement cover as long as it holds, which means they'll arrive looking official, acting official, and making demands that are very hard for a civilian to refuse. He turned. But you're not a civilian, Lena said. He looked at her. Not exactly, he said. Ghost came off the floor again. Same posture as before, rigid, nose working, ears locked forward. But this time his posture was different. Before it had been alert, investigating. Now his body language was the one that meant multiple. It meant direction uncertain. It meant the thing that in the field gets called a 360-degree threat, which is the kind of thing that makes trained people very quiet and very focused very quickly. Elias counted to 5. Then he heard it. Not one set of footsteps this time. Not the careful interval pattern of a single scout. Engines. Snow machines. 2, possibly 3, coming from the direction of the ridge road. The sound was still distant, half a mile, maybe more, but coming closer and coming fast with the specific throttle pattern of vehicles driven by people who knew where they were going. They hadn't needed long to regroup. They had not needed long at all. The engines were getting louder. Elias moved to the far wall and pulled a heavy wool blanket from the storage shelf, then a second one. He crossed to the cot and stripped the mattress, a 4-inch foam pad, and propped it against the window on the north wall at an angle, wedged between the sill and the log wall above it. Not bulletproof. Not even close. But dense foam absorbed fragmentation from window glass and slowed peripheral debris, which in a close-quarters situation was sometimes the difference between a superficial wound and a severed artery. He did it fast and without explanation, and Lena watched him do it with the expression of someone updating their working model of who they were dealing with. How many do you think? She said. Snow machines means at least 2 operators per vehicle, possibly a passenger on each. He moved to the next window. Same process. 3 machines, that's potentially 9 people. I'm going to assume 6. Middle estimate. Enough to be decisive without being so many that they become logistically complicated to deploy in these conditions. 6 against 1. 1.5, he said. You're mobile with the right motivation. She looked at him steadily. I can't shoot. Can you reload? A pause. Yes. Then you're worth half. He wasn't being dismissive. He was doing the math out loud, and she seemed to understand that because she didn't argue. There's a shotgun under the cot. Mossberg 500, 7 rounds in the tube, 2 boxes of shells in the canvas bag beside it. While I'm outside, you load it, and you keep it pointed at the door, and you do not open that door for anyone. Not for a voice you recognize. Not for someone who sounds like they're hurt. Not for any reason that doesn't involve me knocking twice, then once, then twice. She repeated it back. 2, 1, 2. Good. The engine sounds were close now. Close enough to have direction. Northeast, coming along what passed for a road up here, which was really just a fire access cut that hadn't been maintained in 2 years and was currently buried under 3 feet of packed snow. Snow machines could navigate it. Trucks couldn't. That was something. It constrained their approach geometry, and it meant they couldn't bring heavy equipment. Ghost was at the door, rigid, every muscle in his body oriented toward the incoming sound. Elias crouched beside him for exactly 3 seconds, put one hand on the dog's head, firm and flat. Ghost turned and looked at him with those amber eyes. "Not yet," Elias said. "Stay." The dog's muscles stayed coiled, but he stayed. They arrived with their lights off, which told Elias everything he needed to know about their intentions and nothing about their competence. Lights off in a blizzard on a fire access road was tactically sound, no visual signature from a distance, but it also meant they'd been moving blind and relying on whoever had the trail knowledge to navigate, which meant someone in this group knew this mountain, not a hired team pulled in from outside. Local knowledge, someone who'd worked or hunted this range. He counted them through the gap in the kitchen window. 6. He'd called it right. They came off the snow machines in practice sequence, not military, but trained, the movements of people who'd rehearsed this specific kind of approach. 2 stayed with the vehicles, which was either security or backup. He couldn't tell which yet. 4 moved toward the cabin in a loose wedge formation, 2 on each side. They were wearing County Sheriff's Department jackets, tan and brown, the Frostfang County colors, official uniforms, official patches. One of them had a gold star on his chest that caught the gray dawn light for a moment as he moved. A supervisor's star. Sergeant's rank, maybe lieutenant. Elias stepped back from the window. He went to the radio and keyed the handset. "Shadow Actual, this is Ironsight. 6 hostiles on approach, wearing Frostfang County Sheriff's Department uniforms. They are not here in a law enforcement capacity. Requesting confirmation of federal notification status." The response came back in under 10 seconds. "Ironsight, federal notification confirmed. FBI Field Office Aldgate has been alerted. However, deployment remains weather-dependent. You are currently outside any response window. Can you hold?" He looked at the window, at the foam pad wedged against it, at the Glock on the table and the Motorola radio with FC scratched under the battery cover. "Working on it," he said, and set the handset down. He pulled on his jacket, checked the Glock. 16 rounds available. He thought about the math of 16 rounds and 6 armed men and a 14 to 18-hour window and decided that the math was not in his favor and that thinking about it wasn't going to improve it, so he stopped. He opened the door before they knocked. The man with the lieutenant's star was maybe 50, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had spent a lot of time in mountain weather, deeply lined, reddened at the cheeks, eyes that were used to squinting into distances. He stopped when Elias appeared in the doorway. The 3 men flanking him stopped a beat later. "Morning," Elias said. The lieutenant looked at him, then past him, trying to see into the cabin's interior, which the angle and the dim light made difficult. "Sir, Lieutenant Dale Pruitt, Frostfang County Sheriff's Department. We've had a report of a missing deputy," Elias said. "I know. Your colleagues mentioned it earlier." Pruitt's expression didn't change. He was good. The 2 flanking men on Elias's left were worse. One of them had a tell, a slight tightening around the jaw when Pruitt hesitated, which meant they'd been briefed to expect a certain script, and the script had just skipped a page. "My colleagues," Pruitt said. 2 men, scout element. Came through maybe 90 minutes ago. I sent them off." Elias leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. The posture said relaxed. Nothing about him was relaxed. "Want to tell me what's actually happening here, Lieutenant? Because I've been doing this kind of conversation for a long time, and this one is running about 30% off script." Pruitt looked at him with something that recalibrated behind his eyes. "And what kind of conversation is that?" "The kind where someone shows up looking official to find something that they don't have a warrant to look for." "We can get a warrant." "In a blizzard, with every road in the county closed." Elias nodded slowly. "Impressive logistics. Get me the warrant number, and I'll talk to you all day." Pruitt was quiet for 2 seconds. Then, "Sir, we have reason to believe that Deputy Lena Brooks is in physical danger and may have been brought to this location against her will. We're here to ensure her safety." The phrasing was careful, legally careful, the kind of careful that a department attorney had probably coached. Elias noticed this. "She's not here against her will," Elias said. "She's here because I pulled her out of a wrecked cruiser this morning after someone pushed it off Ridge Road 7. Pruitt's face did something, barely. A flicker of something that could have been surprise or could have been confirmation. the expression of a man hearing a fact he already knew stated plainly out loud. "We'll need to see her," Pruitt said. "Conduct a welfare check." "No." The word landed in the space between them like something solid. Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. "Sir, I'm going to need you to—" "No," Elias said again. "She's injured. She's receiving care. You don't have a warrant. You don't have jurisdiction over me or my property. And everything that happens from this point forward is going into a federal report, because I transmitted her location and condition to federal authorities approximately 40 minutes ago, and that channel is still open." The jaw-tightening man on Elias's left shifted his weight. Elias looked at him directly. Not a glance. A full look. The kind that says, "I see exactly what you're thinking about doing." The man stopped shifting. "You transmitted to federal authorities," Pruitt said, slowly. "On a military satellite frequency," Elias said, "which means the transmission is logged, time-stamped, and archived, and the receiving station is already coordinating with FBI field assets. So whatever decision gets made here in the next 5 minutes, it's going to be on record. Every second of it." Pruitt stood in the falling snow and looked at Elias with the expression of a man doing complicated arithmetic in real time. Then he looked at the cabin, then back at Elias. "Step inside with us," Pruitt said quietly, "so we can talk without the weather." "I'm fine with the weather. There are things I need to say that aren't for—" Pruitt glanced at the other 3 men. "That aren't for the group." Elias studied him. Something in the lieutenant's body language had shifted. The official posture was still there, but something underneath it had changed register. A tightening around the eyes that wasn't authority. It was something closer to pressure. The look of a man who had been put in front of a door he didn't particularly want to walk through. "You're not here by choice," Elias said. Pruitt said nothing. "Someone gave you a direct order and you're following it because not following it had consequences you decided weren't worth it." Elias looked at him. "How long have you been on this department, Lieutenant?" "A beat. 17 years. "And how much of what's actually happening do you know?" The line of Pruitt's jaw went hard. His eyes moved to the men on either side of him, then back to Elias. He didn't answer the question, which was, in its way, an answer. "The men who came before you," Elias said. "The scout element. Were they yours?" "No," Pruitt said, and said it quickly enough that Elias believed him. "So you've got people in your county running operations without your knowledge." Pruitt's face said nothing. His hands, at his sides, had curled slightly, not reaching for anything, just holding something in. "Tell your men to wait with the vehicles," Elias said. A long pause. "Give us some space," Pruitt said to the 3 behind him, without turning around. The men exchanged a look. Then they moved back toward the snow machines. Not all the way. 40 feet, which wasn't far enough to be out of earshot in normal conditions. But in a blizzard, the wind handled that problem. Pruitt stepped closer. His voice dropped. "I have a wife," he said. "I have a daughter at Merritt Community College. I have a pension I'm 8 months from vesting." Elias waited. "I was told to bring the deputy back. I was told she was in a mental health crisis and had driven off the road, and that there were concerns about her making false allegations against the department as part of an ongoing personal issue." "That's a comprehensive cover story," Elias said. "It held together until about 30 seconds ago." Pruitt looked at him with eyes that had made some kind of decision in the last few seconds. You could see it happening in them, the slow shift of something settling into place. "Nobody falls off Ridge Road 7, not in a county cruiser. That road has a mountain wall on one side and a guardrail on the other for the full length, except for one section, 40 yards, where the guardrail was removed last spring for road work that was never completed. You know that section. I've driven that road for 17 years. Elias held his gaze. "What do you actually want, Lieutenant?" Pruitt was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed between them. Somewhere behind him, one of the snow machines idled, then went quiet. "I want to go home tonight," Pruitt said. "And I want to still be able to look my daughter in the face when I do." They went inside. Lena was on the floor behind the cot, exactly where Elias had left her, with the Mossberg across her lap and Ghost pressed against her left side. When the door opened, she raised the shotgun in a one-handed grip. Her broken ribs made a two-handed grip mechanically possible, but agony-inducing, and pointed it at the entrance with the focused, controlled expression of someone who had thought clearly about whether or not they were prepared to fire. Pruitt stopped in the doorway. He looked at the shotgun, then at Lena, then at the dried blood on the side of her face and the cervical collar Elias had put on her earlier. He took his hat off. It was such a small and human gesture that it shifted the temperature of the room. "Brooks," he said. "Lieutenant." Her voice was flat, controlled. The shotgun didn't move. "You're in bad shape." "I'm in better shape than whoever pushed my cruiser expected." She looked at him steadily. "Were you there? On that road?" "No." "Do you know who was?" A pause. "I have a suspicion. I don't have confirmation." "Then sit down," she said, "and tell me your suspicion." He sat. Elias remained standing near the door, monitoring the window with one eye on the tree line and one ear on Pruitt. What Pruitt knew, or suspected, was partial and imprecise, the knowledge of a man who had seen peripheral details over many years without the full context to interpret them. He'd noticed the road maintenance billing anomalies 18 months ago and had flagged them verbally to Sheriff Voss, who told him it was a county contract issue being handled. He'd noticed that certain patrol routes generated no radio traffic for hours at a time. He'd noticed that 3 deputies, Harrow, Belkey, and a newer hire named Cassius, responded to calls that weren't in the dispatch log and returned from shifts that had started 6 hours earlier than recorded. He hadn't connected it, or he'd connected it and decided not to finish the picture. "You knew something was wrong," Lena said. "I knew something was off," he said. "That's not the same thing." "For 17 years. For 17 years I raised my daughter and paid my mortgage and did the job the way I understood the job." His voice had an edge in it now. "Don't look at me like that. I didn't do what they did." "You didn't stop it either." The silence that followed was not comfortable. "No," Pruitt said finally. "I didn't." Ghost lifted his head from Lena's side and looked at Pruitt with the particular evaluating attention dogs apply to the moments when humans are deciding something important. Then he put his head back down. Elias had always trusted the dog's read on people, and the dog had elected to relax, which he noted. "Those 3 men," Elias said, "Harrow, Belkey, Cassius, they're with the snow machines right now?" Pruitt turned to look at him. "Harrow and Cassius. Belkey didn't come." "Why not?" "I didn't ask." "Would Belk have come if you'd asked?" Pruitt considered this with more care than the question seemed to require on the surface. "No," he said finally. "I don't think he would." "So Belk might be persuadable." "Possibly. Or he's already been told to cover a different position, and you're hoping he's an ally when he's not." "Fair point." Elias moved to the table, to the Motorola radio he'd taken from the Scout. "Are Harrow and Cassius armed beyond their service weapons?" Pruitt looked at the radio, then at Elias. The fact of the radio, the Scout's radio, in Elias's possession, was doing visible work in Pruitt's face. "Both carry secondary pieces," Pruitt said. "Harrow had a rifle on his machine. I saw the case." A rifle. Outside range changed everything. It meant the area around the cabin was no longer automatically controlled by the walls. A rifle at 400 yards in the hands of someone with training and the patience to lie still in the snow was a different kind of problem than 6 men with pistols at close range. "Where would he set up?" Elias said. Pruitt blinked. "You're asking me where my own deputy would take a sniper position?" "Yes." A long pause. "The rock shelf," Pruitt said slowly. 200 meters northeast. It's elevated. It's got a natural parapet from the granite formation, and it has a clear line of sight to this structure's north and east faces." He stopped. "If I know that, Harrow knows that. He's hunted this area. 200 meters northeast. Through the blizzard, that was marginal visibility for an optic shot, even with good glass. But the storm was slowly, incrementally, beginning to ease. Not enough to call it clearing, but the intervals between gusts were lengthening. In 3 hours, 4 hours, that shot became viable." Elias looked at Pruitt. "I need you to make a decision," he said. "Right now, in the next 60 seconds, before those men outside start wondering why the welfare check is taking this long." Pruitt looked at him. "You go back out there and you tell Harrow and Cassius that you confirmed the deputy is here, that she's injured, that you've called for medical transport, and that everyone is going to stand by until the weather allows evacuation. You give me 4 hours. You park the snow machines and you sit on them, and you don't let Harrow go anywhere near that rock shelf." "And then what?" And then federal assets arrive and this becomes someone else's problem, and you become the man who cooperated with a federal investigation rather than the man who obstructed one. Pruitt sat with that for a moment. If Voss finds out Voss is going to have significantly larger problems than you in approximately 14 hours, Elias said. The question is which side of that you want to be standing on. Another silence. The fire. The wind. The soft sound of ghosts breathing. 4 hours, Pruitt said. 4 hours. Pruitt stood, put his hat back on. He looked at Lena, at the blood dried to her face, at the way she held herself carefully around the broken ribs, at the shotgun she'd kept pointed in his general direction for the entire conversation. "I'm sorry, Brooks," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Don't apologize to me, Dale. Just go keep that rifle out of position." He went. The door closed. The room was quiet except for the fire and the wind and the distant cough of snow machines starting up. Lena lowered the shotgun. Her arm was shaking now, not from fear, but from the sustained effort of holding that weight with broken ribs, and the adrenaline leaving her system all at once the way it does when the immediate crisis steps back without fully departing. She set the weapon on the floor beside her and pressed her free hand flat against her left side. "You think he'll hold?" she asked. "For a while." Elias came away from the window and crouched to her level. Her face had gone pale again, the color that meant the pain was spiking. He checked the clock on the wall above the stove. Nearly 10 a.m. He's a man who spent 17 years not deciding things. He just made his first real decision. It'll hold until he second-guesses it. How long before he second-guesses it? 2 hours? Maybe 3 if he's stubborn. He looked at her. "Can you move?" She looked back at him. "You're going for the card." "I'm going for the card." Elias, in these conditions, alone, the weather window is closing up. In 4 hours it starts to ease and that rifle becomes viable, and we lose the only pressure we have on Harrow's position. I need to move now while the blizzard is still giving me cover. He pulled the pack from under the cot and started checking its contents with the rapid efficiency of someone running a pre-mission checklist. Chemical heat packs. Trauma kit. Compass, because GPS was unreliable in the mountain terrain and he wasn't going to get caught navigating by a device that could fail. Water in an insulated flask. Emergency bivy. Rope. The Glock with 2 spare magazines. 300 meters north of the Blackthorn Pass trailhead, he said without looking up. Second board from the east wall of the outbuilding floor. Yes. She watched him pack. The path there. There's a ridgeline you'll want to stay south of. The north face of that ridge accumulates unstable snow and storms. It looks like solid ground, but it's loaded. How deep is the loading? The last time I hiked it was 5 days ago, and it had a meter of new deposition on old ice. In this storm, add half a meter at least. He adjusted the pack straps and stood. Ghost is staying with you. He won't want to. I know. He crossed to the dog, crouched again. Ghost was already reading his body language, the pack, the jacket, the compressed purposefulness of the movements. And his posture had shifted from companion to working partner, coiled and ready and clearly certain that wherever Elias was going, the correct answer was together. Stay, Elias said. Ghost looked at him. Stay, Ghost. The dog's posture held. He didn't lie down. He was not going to lie down. But his feet stayed where they were. Elias stood, checked the Glock one final time. Then he looked at Lena on the floor with the Mossberg and her broken ribs and the blood-dried brown at her temple and the absolute steadiness in her eyes that had not wavered once since he'd pulled her off that slope. The radio signal goes out every 2 hours, he said. If I'm not back when the next check-in comes, you key the handset, give them the authentication code I gave you, and you tell them my last known heading. Can you do that? Yes. Don't open the door. You already said that. 212. Elias. He stopped. Come back, she said. Not as an instruction, not as a request exactly. Something more basic than either of those things. The kind of statement that exists in the register below sentiment. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he went out the door into the white. The storm had thickened again while they'd been inside. In the 30 minutes since Pruitt had taken his men back to the snow machines, the visibility had dropped further, 20 feet, maybe less. the world reduced to a white tunnel that shifted and breathed around him as he moved. This was as close to zero visibility navigation as you could get without being actually blind, and for most people it would have been paralyzing. For Elias, it was almost familiar. He moved east first, not north. Deliberately wrong direction, 200 meters, cutting through the timber where the snow was shallower under the canopy and his tracks would be obscured by branch fall. Then he turned north, using compass bearing, counting paces in the way that had been drilled into him so long ago. It was motor memory rather than cognition. 70 paces to 100 meters in terrain like this, accounting for slope and drift. The mountain was silent in the way mountains are during heavy snow. Not quiet, because the wind was constant, but sound dampened, the kind of dense acoustic blanketing that makes the world feel like it's been wrapped in something heavy. His own footsteps were almost inaudible to him even as he made them. He moved through a stand of old-growth fir, the trunks massive and dark, the lowest branches 8 feet up and heavy with accumulated snow. 3 times a branch gave way somewhere above him, and a cascade of snow came down in a dense white wave. The 3rd time it happened, it came close enough that he felt the cold displacement of air on his face and had to stop and wait for his vision to clear. He was 40 minutes out from the cabin when he heard the radio crackle. Not his radio. Pruitt's men had radios. And the wind was doing something to the frequencies, catching transmissions from the wrong direction, refracting them through the timber. He stopped and stood motionless and listened. The voice was not Pruitt's. It was younger, flatter, with the cadence of someone reading from a briefing rather than speaking naturally. Confirm the location is secure and the package is inside. Do not make entry until the 2nd element is in position at the north approach. Repeat. Hold position until 2nd element confirms ready. Voss wants this clean. A pause. Another voice. Copy. How long on 2nd element? 40 minutes. Static, then nothing. Elias stood in the snow and thought about what he'd just heard, and the specific word that mattered most in what he'd heard, which was 2nd element, not Pruitt's group, not the scouts from earlier, a 3rd group. Coming from the north, which meant coming from a different access point entirely, which meant Voss had deployed multiple independent elements to this location, full visibility on what the others were doing. Compartmentalized, each element knowing only their piece. That was not the operational architecture of a county sheriff playing fast and loose with internal affairs policy. That was coordinated suppression. That was the kind of planning that people who had done this before did, because improvised operations were messy, and messy operations created evidence, and the last thing Harlan Voss needed right now was more evidence. The 4-day window wasn't just about the delivery. Elias understood that now, with complete clarity, standing in the timber 40 minutes from his cabin with the wind in his face. The 4-day window was the reason all of this had to be finished today. Whatever shipment was moving in 4 days was large enough, or connected to people powerful enough, that nothing in Frostfang County could still be in question when that shipment moved. Not a missing deputy. Not a piece of evidence in a buried collar. Not a man in a remote cabin who'd made a satellite transmission that was currently logged in a federal database. All of it had to disappear. He started moving again, faster now, angling the compass bearing slightly west to give the north approach the widest possible berth. The ridge Lena had warned him about was visible now as a suggestion of elevation through the snow. A darker mass to his right that the storm partially revealed and partially obscured. He stayed south of it, 70 paces, 100 meters. Adjust bearing. Count again. The trees thinned. He was approaching the fire access corridor that led to Blackthorn Pass, and even buried under snow, it was identifiable as an absence of trees, a gap in the canopy where the sky showed through as a slightly lighter shade of gray. He angled toward it. The trailhead parking area was a flat white expanse. Nothing visible. No tracks. The snow was filling any impression within minutes. He crossed it in a low run, staying in the open for exactly the time it took to cross, no more, and came up on the north side against the access road where the tree line resumed. The ranger station was where Lena said it would be. The main structure first, a timber building, shuttered, a padlock on the door that had rusted halfway closed in the mountain moisture. He didn't stop at the main structure, went around it. The outbuilding was smaller, 10 feet by 12, with a metal roof that had accumulated so much snow the walls were bowing slightly outward under the weight. The door was wooden, swelled in the frame from moisture, but not locked. He forced it with his shoulder. It gave with a crack of swollen wood. Inside, old equipment, rusted hand tools on a wall rack, a metal shelf with ancient first aid supplies. The floor was raw timber planking, dark with age, the gaps between boards wide enough to see dirt beneath. He went to the east wall, counted boards from the wall edge. The second board was slightly different from the others. Not obviously. You'd have to be looking, and looking with the expectation that something was there. The grain ran the same direction. The age coloration matched. But there was a faint hairline along one edge where the board had been lifted and reset, and the nails on that board were fractionally newer than the ones holding its neighbors. The rust pattern was different, shallower. He took out his knife, used the blade to work into the gap, lifted. The board came up. In the dirt beneath it, a sealed plastic bag, the kind used for food storage. Inside the bag, wrapped in a cloth strip, was a leather dog collar. Old, worn at the edges, the name Duke stamped into the leather near the buckle. The stitching along one side of the padding was intact, but if you pressed the padding carefully, you could feel the slight rigidity of something that shouldn't be there. He pressed along the seam, found the edge where it had been carefully opened and re-sewn, took the knife again and worked with precision, not cutting, pulling stitches, the way a surgeon removes sutures. The lining opened. The memory card was there. 14 gigabytes in a chip, smaller than his thumbnail, sitting in the dirt of an abandoned outbuilding in the Frostfang Mountains while a blizzard raged outside. He held it in his palm and looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then he sealed it in the innermost pocket of his thermal layer, against his chest where body heat would keep it from any moisture infiltration. Resecured his jacket, replaced the board, stood up. Outside, the wind had shifted. He felt it before he heard anything. The specific change in air pressure that comes when something large and mechanical is operating nearby. A different quality to the sound underneath the storm. Not snow machines. Something heavier. He pressed himself to the wall beside the outbuilding door and looked out through the gap. Across the access road, on the far edge of the parking area, 2 figures were moving through the snow. Dark clothing again. No high-vis. Moving in the interval pattern. The controlled, deliberate advance of trained personnel. Second element. From the north. Right on schedule. They were 40 meters away, coming toward the ranger station in a direction that suggested they either knew exactly what they were looking for or had been given the station as a search objective. Either way, in 30 seconds, they would be at the main structure. In 90 seconds, they would be at the outbuilding. Elias looked at the 2 figures. Then he looked at the tree line to his south, the way back, his path home, the direction that required crossing 40 meters of open ground with no cover. He thought about the memory card against his chest. Then he moved. He came out of the outbuilding at a full sprint, low and angled, cutting south and east at a diagonal that put the main structure of the ranger station between him and the 2 approaching figures for the first critical seconds. The snow was deep enough to slow him. Every stride a controlled fall and recovery, his thighs burning with the effort of pulling his feet clear of the pack with each step. He heard a shout behind him. One of the figures had seen him, not identified him, not in these conditions, in this weather, at this distance, but seen movement, which was enough. He hit the tree line. Behind him, the sound of running feet in snow, heavy, crashing, the gait of men moving fast and without the discipline to stay quiet. Good. Noise meant urgency. Urgency meant mistakes. He ran. The compass was in his hand, but he wasn't looking at it. He was navigating by the timber, by the slope angle under his feet, by the accumulated memory of moving through this specific terrain in the last 2 hours. The trees closed around him, and the white swallowed the station behind him, and the shouts faded as the storm in the distance did their work. He didn't slow down for a quarter mile. When he did, he stopped behind a massive fir and pressed his back against it and listened. His own breathing was the loudest thing he could hear, working to get back under control, air burning in lungs that had just handled a hard sprint at altitude and extreme cold. No footsteps behind him. They hadn't followed into the timber. Smart, or instructed not to separate from the search area. He stood against the tree and waited for his breathing to normalize and thought about the second element, knowing the ranger station and the word clean and the 40-minute timeline, and Pruitt sitting on a snow machine outside a cabin with a man named Harrow who had a rifle and was already thinking about that rock shelf 200 meters to the northeast. He thought about the memory card against his chest. He pushed off the tree and started moving south, back toward the cabin. The storm was still thick around him, but he could feel something in the quality of the light, a subtle shift in the gray, a fractional brightening that had nothing to do with time of day and everything to do with cloud layer. The blizzard was beginning to exhaust itself. Not done, not even close to done. But the worst of it was passing, and in a few hours the visibility would open up. And when it did, every calculation in this situation would change at once. He moved faster. He made the cabin in just under an hour. The last quarter mile he ran at a pace that was not sustainable, and he knew it, burning reserves he'd need later. But the light had shifted again while he was in the timber, and the meaning of that shift was unambiguous. The blizzard was pulling back faster than the meteorological estimate. The gusts were still heavy, but the intervals between them had opened from seconds to minutes. And when the wind dropped, the visibility extended to 50, 60, 80 feet. Not clear, but clear enough for a man with a rifle and a rock shelf and a clear line of sight to the north and east faces of a timber cabin. He came around the south side of the structure and knocked on the door. 2. 1. 2. The door opened before the second pattern finished. Lena had the Mossberg pointed at chest height, muzzle dropping when she saw him. She was on her feet, barely, one hand braced against the door frame, the color in her face wrong, too pale at the center and too red at the edges, the color of someone running on nothing but adrenaline and stubbornness. "You're back," she said. "I said I would be." "You're bleeding." He looked down. The left sleeve of his jacket had a dark patch near the elbow that he hadn't noticed. At some point in the run through the timber, he'd caught something. A branch end, a rock face in the dark. He hadn't felt it happening. He pressed the arm against his side. Not deep, not arterial. One more thing to deal with after the more immediate things. "Get away from the door," he said, and came inside. Ghost hit him the moment he cleared the threshold. 78 pounds of German Shepherd, making contact at hip height, not jumping but pressing. The dog's full body weight leaning into his legs with the specific urgency of an animal that had spent the last hour listening to wind and distant sounds and managing a level of concern it couldn't express any other way. "I know," Elias said, and put one hand briefly on the dog's head. "I know." He crossed to the table, set the pack down, reached into his thermal layer and withdrew the plastic bag with the collar inside. Set it on the table under the lamp. Lena looked at it from across the room. Something moved through her face, so not relief exactly, more like the physical release of a tension she'd been holding at a cellular level for weeks. "You got it," she said. "I got it." And there were 2 men at the station. He was already at the radio pulling off his outer gloves. Second element came in from the north. They didn't see my face, but they saw movement. They'll know someone was there. They'll know someone was there and left in a hurry, which tells them the card may be gone, which changes the value calculation on keeping this quiet. He keyed the handset. "Shadow Actual, this is Ironsight. Evidence package is secured. I have confirmation of a third element operating in the area, separate from the group previously identified. Came in from a northern access point. Update threat assessment to high multiple. What's the status on deployment?" The response took 20 seconds. "Ironsight. Weather at the airfield is still marginal but improving. We have 2 FBI units positioning at the county boundary. They cannot advance until the road situation improves. Current estimate for viable road access is 3 to 4 hours. Can you maintain?" 3 to 4 hours. He looked at the window, at the light outside, which was definitely brighter than it had been 30 minutes ago. "We'll maintain," he said. "Ironsight out." He set the handset down and turned to look at the room with the evaluating eye of someone doing a tactical assessment of a space he'd lived in for 4 years and was only now seeing clearly as a defensive position. The cabin was 30 feet by 20. 2 windows on the north face, one east, one west, none on the south where the wood stove chimney ran. 4-inch log walls, not rated for rifle fire but capable of stopping pistol rounds and slowing rifle rounds significantly. 1 door, solid timber, with a steel hasp block he'd installed himself. The foam mattress pads were still against the north windows. "Good. Talk to me about Harrow," he said. Lena came away from the door frame and lowered herself carefully onto the cot. "Kyle Harrow. 8 years on the department. Before that, Army. I don't know his MOS, it wasn't in his personnel file. He's Voss's go-to for anything that requires someone who asks fewer questions than the average deputy. Does he know this terrain? He grew up in Frostfang, hunts the ridge every fall. She paused. He'll know where Pruitt is weak. Pruitt won't hold much longer, Elias said. The second element making contact with Harrow is going to change the dynamic out there. Harrow will push. So what do we do? He looked at her. We change the geometry before he can set it. She looked back at him with an expression that said she understood exactly what that meant and wasn't sure how she felt about it. You're going to go back out there. Harrow at that rock shelf is the most dangerous single variable right now. Everything else I can manage at close range. A rifle at 200 meters with improving visibility. I can't manage that from inside these walls. You go out there and Pruitt sees you moving, his agreement falls apart. Pruitt's agreement is already falling apart. He was checking the Glock again, the magazine, the chamber. He's been sitting on that snow machine for 90 minutes with Harrow in his ear. Men like Pruitt don't stay decided. They oscillate. Whatever half of him that made the right choice an hour ago is losing ground to the half that's thinking about his pension and his daughter. Lena was quiet for a moment, then, carefully, "What do you need me to do?" "Same as before. Stay down. Keep Ghost here." He hesitated. "There's something else." She waited. He pulled out the memory card, held it up between two fingers. "If something happens to me, this goes in your boot. Not your pocket. Your boot, inner soul. And when federal agents arrive, you hand it to the senior agent directly. You watch them bag it, and you get the agent's name and badge number before you let go of it. Nothing is going to happen to you." "Lena." She met his eyes, held them. Then she reached out and took the card, and without any ceremony or sentiment, she bent forward, wincing at her ribs, and worked off her right boot and placed the card against the inner sole and pulled the boot back on. "Agent's name and badge number," she said, "before you let go of it." "Before I let go of it." She looked up at him. "For what it's worth, and I know it might not be worth much right now. What you did out there, going to that station alone, in those conditions, with people in the field who were looking for you." She stopped, started again differently. "That wasn't nothing." He looked at her for a moment. "It was basic," he said, and meant it. She shook her head slightly. "No, it wasn't. He went out the east side this time, through the small ventilation panel he'd widened 2 winters ago when the wood stove had been throwing sparks, and he'd needed rapid outside access without using the main door. It was barely large enough for a man his size, and getting through it was graceless and painful, and caught the cut on his arm in a way that made him breathe hard through his nose for 5 seconds after he was clear. Outside, the world had changed again. The blizzard was definitively receding. The gusts were still real and still cold, but the snowfall had diminished from whiteout to heavy, and the visibility had opened to something close to 150 feet. In the thin gray light of mid-morning, the mountain was revealing itself in stages, tree shapes resolving out of the white, the ridgeline becoming visible to the northeast as a dark mass against a sky that was pale rather than gray, which meant the rock shelf was becoming visible. He moved east first, staying in the shadow of the cabin's east wall, then angled north into the timber at a point that would take him wide of the direct line between the cabin and the shelf. He was working from memory and compass, adding the new visual information as it became available. The snow machines were parked 200 meters south of the cabin, on the fire access road, just visible as dark shapes when a gust paused. He counted what he could see. 2 machines, 2 figures standing nearby. Pruitt and one other. He couldn't see Harrow. Harrow wasn't with the machines. Elias stopped moving and stood still in the timber and thought about that. Harrow wasn't with the machines, which meant Harrow had already moved, and the question was when he'd moved and whether Pruitt had stopped him or allowed it or hadn't been paying attention. He looked northeast. The rock shelf was perhaps 170 meters from his current position, elevated on the granite formation, visible now as a distinct horizontal line of dark stone against the snow. Movement on it would be visible against that background shot, but movement at it, approaching from below, in the timber, would be harder to pick out. He moved. Slower now. More careful. The timber here was old growth, the trees wide enough to stand behind, the root systems creating small ridges in the snow surface that he used to vary his movement pattern. Not a straight line, never a straight line, but an irregular lateral weave that would make him harder to track visually if someone was watching from elevation. He was 50 meters from the shelf base when he heard the radio traffic again. His own handheld, not the Motorola, the cabin channel Lena was monitoring. Lena's voice, clipped and controlled. "Iron sight, this is base. I have movement on the south approach. 2 figures, not Pruitt's group. I think it's the second element that came through the station. They're on foot and they're moving toward the cabin." He keyed without stopping his movement. "Copy. Hold position. Do not fire unless they breach the door. 2-1-2 is still valid." "Copy." A pause. "Elias. Still here. Be fast." He pocketed the radio and moved faster. Opat. The base of the granite formation came up through the timber. A wall of dark stone, 10 feet high, the upper face angling back to create the natural shelf that Pruitt had described. The rock was wet and ice-crusted, the footholds not obvious. He went up the left side where a crack in the formation created a natural ladder, taking it in 4 moves, keeping his body flat against the stone. He cleared the lip of the shelf. Kyle Harrow was 20 feet to his right. Prone in the snow, rifle up, a bolt action with a quality scope mounted high. He'd built himself a rudimentary firing position from the loose stone and snow at the shelf's edge, creating a parapet that broke his silhouette and protected his front. His attention was completely downslope toward the cabin. His left hand was controlling the rifle's foregrip with the practiced stillness of someone who spent real time behind glass, the kind of stillness you only get from thousands of hours of trigger time. It was 190 meters from the cabin's north face, and he had not heard Elias come over the lip. Elias crossed the shelf in 8 steps, fast and low, and had his knee on Harrow's rifle arm and the Glock pressed behind Harrow's right ear before the man had processed that he wasn't alone. Harrow went completely rigid. "Let go of the rifle," Elias said. The man's breathing was audible. He was thinking. Elias could feel it, the rapid assessment happening in the body he was controlling, the weight shift that preceded a potential reversal attempt. He pressed the muzzle harder. "I know what you're thinking," Elias said. "It's not math that works in your favor. Let go of the rifle." Harrow let go. Elias reached past him and slid the rifle back from the shelf edge without taking the muzzle off Harrow. Then he pulled Harrow's sidearm from the hip holster. The man flinched at the contact, a full-body flinch, the involuntary response of someone whose adrenaline was running at a level that was affecting motor control. Elias tossed the pistol into the snow behind them. "Sit up," he said, slowly, both hands where I can see them. Harrow sat up. He was late 30s, thick-necked, with the outdoor weathering of someone who spent genuine time in these mountains. His face was doing something complicated, fear and anger and something else, a calculation that hadn't resolved yet. "You're a Mercer," Harrow said. "That's right. You have no idea what you've walked into." "I have a pretty complete idea," Elias said. 4-day delivery window, multiple transport routes under department protection, a county sheriff who's been running this for at least 4 years. He watched Harrow's face as he said it. The face confirmed things. "And a federal investigation that's currently about 3 hours from having road access." Harrow went still in a different way, the calculating stillness. 3 hours, Harrow said, give or take. A lot can happen in 3 hours. Yes, Elias said. It can. That's why I'm up here and you're not behind this rifle anymore. Harrow looked at him with an expression that was trying to decide whether to be contemptuous or afraid, and was landing somewhere between the two. You're the guy who's been living in that cabin. Washed out military, everyone says. Couldn't handle whatever happened over there and came up here to disappear. Elias didn't say anything. That's what Voss said when we got the location. Sighed to expect a guy who was probably half gone by now. Isolation does that. Harrow studied him. You don't look half gone. I'm having a productive morning, Elias said. Turn around, face down slope, keep your hands visible. You can't hold me up here for 3 hours. I don't need 3 hours, I need 20 minutes. He keyed the radio with his free hand. Base, this is iron sight. Rifle element is neutralized. What's your status on the south approach? Lena's voice came back thin and tight. They made entry to the perimeter. They're at the woodpile. I can see them through the east window. 2 armed men at the woodpile, 40 feet from the cabin door. Pruitt and whoever was with him at the snow machines to the south. Harrow neutralized on the shelf, but neutralized meant controlled. not resolved, and Elias had one hand managing Harrow and one hand holding a radio and the Glock holstered because he didn't have three hands. The math was getting complicated. Lena, listen to me carefully. He kept his voice level. The wood stove chimney. Is it drawing? A pause. Yes. Damp the stove. Close the damper most of the way. It'll start producing visible smoke reduction from the stack within 2 minutes. He looked at Harrow while he talked, watching the man's hands, watching the small shifts in posture. When the smoke changes, they're going to think something happened inside and they'll move to the door. And when they're at the door, they'll be bunched, predictable position, and Pruitt is going to see them move, and Pruitt is going to have to decide whether he follows them or holds back. And if Pruitt follows, all of them are at the south face and nobody is covering any other approach. A silence. You want me to open the door? Lena said. No. I want you to unlock the door and get to the floor behind the cot and not touch it. Can you do that? Elias, if they come through that door, they won't get through it. He paused. I'll be there first. Another silence. The wind. Harrow's breathing. Copy, Lena said. Elias looked at Harrow. He made a decision that was not clean and not comfortable, and he made it anyway, which was how most real decisions worked. He put the radio in his pocket, picked up Harrow's rifle by the barrel, swung it once against the granite shelf face, felt the scope shatter and the receiver bend. Unusable. Dropped it. On your feet, he said. Harrow stood. Walk down slope. In front of me. If you run or change direction without my instruction, I will put you down, and I will not feel conflicted about it. Harrow looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of a man who had revised his assessment of a situation and didn't like the revision. They went down the rock face and into the timber. The south face of the cabin came into view through the trees as they cleared the last timber stand. The two men from the second element were at the door. Elias could see them from 60 meters, both in dark tactical clothing, one with his hand on the door handle, the other positioned to his left covering the window angle. Standard two-man entry stack, textbook, the kind of formation that worked perfectly until something disrupted the geometry. Pruitt was 20 meters behind them, moving toward the cabin, slowly, the walk of a man who hadn't decided whether he was participating or observing. The second man who'd been with him at the snow machines was no longer visible. Elias moved out of the tree line. Frostfang County, he said, loud enough to carry across the snow. All of you, stop moving. Everyone stopped. The two tactical men turned. Pruitt turned. Harrow, in front of Elias, went tense, but stopped as instructed. My name is Elias Mercer, he said. I'm a former naval special warfare operator. I have a federal open channel logged in the last 2 hours that has recorded this entire situation. The deputy inside this cabin is alive and in possession of evidence that directly connects Sheriff Harlan Voss to 4 years of illegal weapons trafficking. Federal law enforcement is inbound with a current ETA of under 3 hours. The two tactical men looked at each other. There are two options here, Elias said. First option, you make entry. I will stop you. And I want to be very clear that I am not describing that as a threat or a prediction, but as a physical fact. I will stop you, and whatever happens in the process of stopping you becomes part of the federal record on this case. And every one of your names, badge numbers, and radio communications from this morning are going into that record. He paused. Second option, you stand down, right now. You put your weapons on the ground, you move to the south perimeter, and when federal agents arrive, you cooperate with their initial interview. Silence. The taller of the two tactical men, late 30s, clean-shaved, the look of someone who was used to his orders going unchallenged, looked at Harrow. Harrow, he said, where's your rifle? Broken, Harrow said. The man looked at Elias with something that was recalibrating in real time. You broke a scoped rifle. It's on the shelf if you want to check, Elias said. The scope had a good life. Another silence. The clean-shaved man looked at his partner. His partner gave a small, barely perceptible shake of the head that meant, this is not what we planned for. Pruitt, the man said. Pruitt was standing behind both of them, 8 meters back, and he hadn't moved since Elias had come out of the tree line. He was looking at Elias with an expression that had gone through several revisions in the last 30 seconds and had landed somewhere Elias hadn't entirely expected. Boylan, Pruitt said, and his voice was flat. "Put the weapon down." The clean-shaved man, Boylan, turned to look at Pruitt. "Lieutenant, put it down." Pruitt's voice had something in it that hadn't been there before, a quality that had been suppressed for 17 years under the weight of mortgages and pension vesting schedules and the specific cowardice of a good man who had chosen convenience over conscience so many times that it had become invisible to him. It was audible now, present and certain in a way that it apparently hadn't been in a long time. "Voss isn't going to protect you. He's not going to protect any of us. Look at what's standing in front of you and tell me if you believe the story we were told about who lives in that cabin." Boylan looked at Elias. Elias looked back at him. Boylan set his weapon on the snow. His partner hesitated for 4 seconds, a long time in the arithmetic of this kind of moment, and then did the same. Harrow, still in front of Elias, exhaled a long, controlled breath and put his hands behind his head without being asked. The gesture of someone who had finished calculating and arrived at acceptance. Elias held the position for 30 seconds, watching all 4 of them, watching the perimeter, watching the tree line. Nothing moved, no additional element. The third group at the station had either held their position or retreated, and either way they weren't here, which was the only thing that mattered right now. He crossed to the cabin door. Knocked. 2. 1. 2. The door opened. Lena was on her feet in the doorway with the Mossbergen ghost pressing past her legs to get to Elias, the dog's whole hindquarters moving with the involuntary relief of an animal that had spent a tense hour managing its anxiety through motionlessness and was now physically incapable of restraint. Elias put one hand on the dog's head and kept his eyes on the 4 men in the snow. Lena looked past him, at Harrow with his hands behind his head, at Boylan and his partner disarmed in the snow, at Pruitt, who was looking at the ground near his feet. "Dale," she said. Pruitt looked up. "Call dispatch," she said, "on your county radio on your recorded channel. State your location and state that you are on scene with an injured officer and 4 individuals cooperating with a federal investigation. Use those exact words, cooperating with a federal investigation." Pruitt looked at her for a moment. Then he reached for his shoulder-mounted radio and did exactly that. The transmission went out at 11:42 a.m. on a recorded county frequency that would be archived and time-stamped and would become, 6 days later, one of the key pieces of corroborating evidence in the federal indictment of Sheriff Harlan Voss and 7 co-conspirators. None of them knew that yet. Right now, there was just a deputy's voice on a radio, flat and precise, laying down a statement of fact in the middle of a mountain blizzard that was finally, slowly, releasing its grip on the Frostfang Range. Ota. The 3 hours that followed were not elegant. That was the thing about situations that looked decisive from the outside. The moment of resolution was clean, but the aftermath was administrative and cold and painful and full of the small problems that arrived once the adrenaline burned out. Elias's arm needed proper cleaning and 3 sutures he gave himself at the kitchen table with supplies from the trauma kit, a process that was as unpleasant as it sounds, and that he did without comment while Lena sat across from him and watched with the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by him but wasn't entirely comfortable with him either. Ghost lay under the table and put his chin on Elias's boot. Outside, Pruitt had organized the 4 men into a controlled wait near the snow machines, and to his credit, he'd managed it without additional incident. Whatever decision he'd made when he told Boylan to put down the weapon seemed to have calcified into something he was going to maintain, at least for the duration of this morning. The federal agents arrived at 2:17 p.m., not helicopters. The weather hadn't broken enough for rotary assets. They came up the fire access road in 2 high-clearance SUVs with chains on every tire, having spent the last 3 hours working their way from the county boundary through roads that were technically passable and practically brutal. There were 4 of them, 2 from the FBI field office in Aldgate and 2 federal marshals, and they arrived with the particular energy of people who had been briefed in a vehicle on a bad road for 2 hours and were operating off incomplete information and wanted the information completed immediately. The senior agent's name was Carver, female, early 40s, with short dark hair and the manner of someone who had been in high-stakes rooms before and was not going to perform urgency just because other people were feeling it. She came into the cabin, looked at Lena on the cot, looked at Elias at the kitchen table with 3 fresh sutures in his left arm, looked at Ghost under the table, and took in the foam mattress pads against the windows and the shattered remains of the Motorola radio on the table and the Glock that Elias hadn't bothered to put away. "Mercer," she said. "Agent Carver." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was working through something. "I got a file on you this morning when your authentication came through. Navy SEAL, Tier 1, 4 combat deployments, 2 service commendations." A pause. "And an open administrative review." "That's accurate." "The review has been pending for 3 years." "Also accurate." "Do you want to tell me what happened on that operation?" He looked at her steadily. "I want to do that in about 4 hours when this situation is fully documented and the evidence is in federal custody, in that order." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Single, professional nod. She turned to Lena. "Deputy Brooks, I understand you have something for me." Lena reached down and pulled off her right boot. She extracted the memory card from the inner sole, held it up between her thumb and forefinger, and looked at Carver. "Agent Carver," Lena said. "Badge number." Carver reached into her jacket and produced her credentials without blinking, held them out. Lena read the badge number aloud, and Elias, who had been watching, repeated it. Carver noticed him do this, and something that might have been the beginning of professional respect moved through her expression. Lena handed over the card. Carver took it, held it the same way Elias had held it in the outbuilding, looking at it for exactly 1 second. Then she turned and called out to one of the marshals. "Pearson, evidence bag." She bagged and sealed it with Lena and Elias both watching, initialed the seal, noted the time. Clean chain of custody from the moment of transfer forward. Then she looked at Elias again. The look had something different in it now. Not warmer exactly, but more considered, like she was adding information to a file and the file was changing shape. "The transmission you made this morning," she said. "The frequency you used." "Yes." "That frequency hasn't been active in a long time." "I know." "Who taught you the authentication protocol for that channel?" He looked at her. "My commanding officer. Operation out of Kandahar, 2016 miles." He paused. "Who is now a 2-star in the Pentagon, if that matters." Carver was quiet for a moment. Whatever she was calculating, she was doing it carefully. "I'd like you to come in for a formal interview," she said. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon." "About Brooks and Voss?" "About that, and about your review." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, through the window where the foam mattress pad had been removed, the mountain was visible for the first time all day. Snow-covered ridgelines against a sky that had opened from gray to pale white, the storm's last remnants pulling east. The rock shelf was visible from here, a dark horizontal line against the white. Empty now. "I'll come in," he said. Carver moved away to coordinate with the marshals. One of the FBI agents had set up a field documentation station at the far end of the table, a laptop and a scanner and a portable satellite link, and was already working through initial evidence protocols with a focus and speed that suggested he'd done this setup in worse conditions. Lena was watching Elias from the cot. He could feel it. "She said your review," Lena said, quiet enough that it was just between them. "She did." "You're going to let them look at it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the marshals was escorting Harrow and Boylan and the others toward the SUVs with the practiced efficiency of people who did this for a living. Pruitt walked on his own, without cuffs, and the distinction was visible and deliberate, and Harrow noticed it, and his face showed what he thought about it. "I've been up here 4 years waiting for that file to go away," Elias said. "It didn't go away." "No," Lena said. "So." He looked at the mountain through the window, at the ridgeline going clear in the afternoon light, sharp and cold and very real. "Might as well face it." Ghost came out from under the table and sat beside him. Not pushing, not demanding, just present the way the dog had always been present. Beside him, not in front of him. Elias put his hand on the back of the dog's neck. The evidence was in federal custody. The channel was documented. Harrow and Boylan and the others were in federal transport. Pruitt had made his choice and would live with what that meant for the next several years in ways that were beyond anyone's control. The memory card was in a federal evidence bag on its way to a processing facility where 14 gigabytes of financial records and encrypted communications and 6 damning audio recordings would begin the slow, thorough work of dismantling 4 years of carefully constructed criminal infrastructure. It wouldn't be fast. Nothing legitimate ever was. The walls of it were already visible, though, in the way the walls of a structure become visible when you start pulling out the foundations. Things that had been load-bearing for years beginning to shift and crack and admit the light. Carver came back to the table with a tablet, sat across from Elias with the deliberate posture of someone who had a lot of questions and had organized them into an order. "Walk me through this morning," she said. "Start from when you first observed the smoke." He looked at her, looked at the tablet, looked at the recorder she placed beside it, small and professional, the red light coming on when she pressed the button. He thought about ghost freezing at the kitchen window at Joe 612. He thought about black smoke against white sky. He thought about a woman counting her own broken ribs on an ice shelf in a blizzard and deciding that the evidence mattered more than her survival. He thought about 4 years of silence in a cabin that the world had forgotten. He pulled his chair forward. "It started with the dog," he said. Carver was a precise interviewer. She didn't lead. She didn't editorialize. She asked a question, listened to the full answer without interrupting, and followed up only where the answer created a gap that needed filling. Elias had been interviewed by military investigators, by JAG officers, by a civilian attorney who'd spent 40 minutes telling him how bad his situation was before asking a single factual question. Carver was different from all of them. She was interested in the actual sequence of events, in the specific and verifiable, and she had the professional discipline to keep her own reactions off her face while she collected them. He talked for 90 minutes. He went through it in order: the smoke, the ravine, Lena's condition, the first 2 scouts, the radio transmission, Pruitt's arrival, and the conversation on the cabin step. The decision to go for the card, the second element at the station, the retrieval, Harrow on the rock shelf. He was precise about times where he had them and estimated carefully where he didn't. He described the Motorola radio with the FC scratching, and Carver's partner bagged it without comment. He described the 2 men at the ranger station and their approach direction, and Carver made a note and exchanged a look with the marshal by the door that suggested this was confirming something rather than creating something new. When he was done, Carver closed the tablet cover and turned off the recorder. She sat with it for a moment. "The scratched initials on the Motorola," she said. "Standard department issue radios are tagged for tracking. That scratch was either someone being sloppy or someone marking their own equipment in a habit they'd developed before they understood the implications." "Harrow," Elias said. "Probably." She looked at him steadily. "Mercer. The authentication code you used this morning, the frequency. I want to be direct with you about something." He waited. "When your transmission came in, the duty officer flagged your name immediately, not because of your service record, because of the review file." She folded her hands on the table. "There were people in that building this morning who argued against responding, who said the transmission was a possible false flag, possibly a setup, possibly a man with an open review file trying to manufacture a situation that would get the file closed." The fire popped. Ghost's ear twitched. "I know," Elias said. "You knew they'd think that." "I knew some of them would." He looked at her. "I transmitted anyway." Carver studied him with an expression that was doing more work than it showed. Why? He thought about how to answer that. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because the accurate answer was simple enough that it was going to sound like he'd constructed it to sound good, which he hadn't. Because a woman counted her own broken ribs in a blizzard to protect evidence that mattered, he said. And the people who should have responded to that weren't going to, so someone had to. Carver was quiet for a moment. "The review file," she said. "Kandahar, 2019, in operation called Grey Wall." He went still. "You know it," she said. It wasn't a question. "I was there?" "You flagged the planning, multiple times. You went on record with your CO that the intelligence sourcing for the target package was compromised. You said the secondary structure that Command had designated as a confirmed hostile staging area was being used by a protected source." "Yes." "And Command overruled you and ran the operation." "Yes." "And the secondary structure was in fact being used by a protected source. 3 civilians died in the breach. And the review placed the operational error on your pre-mission descent as evidence of insufficient team cohesion rather than on the intelligence failure." He looked at the table. At the grain of the wood, the rings in the timber, the coffee stain he'd never fully gotten out near the corner. He'd looked at that stain every morning for 4 years. "That's a concise summary," he said. I read the file this morning, Carver said. On the road up here. She paused. The protected source. The one who was in the secondary structure. He was debriefed 6 weeks after the operation. His debrief is classified, but the existence of the debrief is logged in a connected file that your review board never accessed because nobody told them to look for it. Elias looked up at her. That debrief, Carver said carefully, confirms that the source had been operating out of that structure for 11 months prior to Greywall, which means the intelligence failure was systemic and predated your descent by almost a year. She held his gaze. Your review board made their finding without that information. The room was very quiet. Outside, he could hear the federal marshal talking to someone near the vehicles, the low professional murmur of official business being conducted. He could hear the wind, lighter now, moving through the pines with less fury than it had all morning. He could hear Ghost breathing under the table. Why are you telling me this? Elias said. Because you deserve to know it exists. And because when I file my report on this morning, I'm going to include a notation that the authentication code used by the transmitting party was valid and professionally executed, and that the situation described in the transmission was confirmed in full upon arrival, and that the transmitting party demonstrated conduct consistent with the highest standards of the service he was separated from. She paused. I can't reopen the review. That's above my pay grade. But the notation goes into the connected file, and connected files have a way of getting in front of the right people when the right people are looking. Elias held her gaze for a long moment. He didn't say thank you. The words felt inadequate, and she didn't seem to be looking for them anyway. What he did was nod, once, the specific nod of one professional acknowledging something from another, and Carver received it the same way. She stood, picked up the recorder and the tablet. The interview is complete, she said. You're not under any obligation to remain on scene, but I'd appreciate it if you stayed accessible for the next 72 hours in case we need follow-up. I'll be here, he said. She walked away toward the documentation station, and Elias sat at the kitchen table in the cabin he'd lived in alone for 4 years and looked at the coffee stain and breathed. They took Lena out by ground transport at 4 in the afternoon. The decision was the medics. One of the federal marshals had field medical certification, and after examining Lena's ribs and the lacerations and running through a neurological check, he'd made the call that helicopter wasn't necessary and ground was preferable given the remaining wind conditions at altitude. St. Catharines and Merritt had reopened as the roads cleared. The drive would take 90 minutes in the current conditions. Elias helped them transfer her to the stretcher. She insisted on walking to the door under her own power, which the medic tolerated because Elias could see that arguing with her was not a productive use of anyone's time, and because he understood the impulse. There were injuries to the body, and then there were injuries to the sense of agency, and Lena had spent 12 hours having her agency stripped away by people with guns and institutional cover, and walking out her own door on her own feet was the first reclamation of something that mattered. She made it to the cabin door before her legs had something to say about it. Elias was there. He didn't make anything of it, just provided the point of stability she needed to get through the door and down the single step to the snow outside, and then the medic took over and got her onto the stretcher with professional care. She looked up at the sky. The storm had pulled back enough that actual blue was visible to the west, a thin strip of it above the ridgeline, the specific shade of winter sky that only appears after heavy weather when the air has been scoured clean. I forgot what the sky looked like, she said. Elias looked up. It's been a long day. Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what happens now? For you, I mean. He thought about Carver's notation, about connected files and the right people looking, about 3 years of administrative limbo that had maybe, possibly, started moving this morning in a direction that wasn't backward. I don't know, he said, which was true. Something different than before. She looked at him from the stretcher with eyes that were tired and clear at the same time, the eyes of someone who had been through something and come out the other side knowing things they hadn't known going in. You should come down from this mountain sometime, she said. The world's not as bad as you think it is. The world pushed your cruiser off a cliff this morning. The world also sent you to pull me out. She held his gaze. Those aren't in the same category. He didn't have an answer for that. She didn't seem to need one. The medic secured the stretcher. Ghost stood at Elias's left side, watching, as the marshal team loaded Lena into the back of the second SUV with the careful efficiency of people who had done medical transports in field conditions before. The door closed. The engine started. Elias stood in the snow outside his cabin and watched the vehicles work their way back down the fire access road, their taillights dimming as the distance and the remaining snow swallowed them. Ghost sat down next to him and pressed his weight against Elias's left leg. They stood there until the lights disappeared. The next 6 weeks were not cinematic. That was the thing nobody told you about the aftermath of something like this. The actual resolution of a situation that had compressed an enormous amount of consequence into a single terrible day was slow, bureaucratic, often frustrating, and arrived in pieces rather than all at once. Harlan Voss was arrested at his home in Frostfang Town at 9 a.m. the morning after the mountain events, which became known in the federal filing simply as the December 14th incident. He came to the door in a bathrobe and said nothing to the arresting agents beyond asking to see a warrant, which they had, and requesting to call his attorney, which he did. He was processed and transferred to federal holding in Aldgate before noon. His department, operating under emergency supervision by a state-appointed acting sheriff, continued its daily operations in a state of suspended disbelief that the local paper described, accurately, as an institution trying to function while simultaneously understanding that its entire structure had been built on a foundation that had just been removed. Kyle Harrow and Marcus Boylan, the clean-shaved man, were charged with federal obstruction, conspiracy, and weapons trafficking facilitation. Harrow's attorney tried to establish a coercion defense, arguing that Voss had leverage over his personnel through documentation of minor departmental violations that he used as informal blackmail. The argument had partial merit and generated significant legal discussion and ultimately reduced Harrow's exposure from the maximum, which was a long time, to something shorter but still substantial. Boylan, who had no such defense and who had been more directly involved in the weapons transport operation than Harrow, did not fare as well. The second element from the ranger station, 2 private contractors whose names did not appear in any county department personnel file, and who had been hired through a shell company connected to a logistics firm that connected, through 3 more layers of corporate paperwork, to a real estate holding company in which Voss was a silent partner, were arrested 4 days after the mountain events when federal agents identified them from Elias's description and cross-referenced it with hotel registrations in Merritt. They declined to cooperate. Their attorney was very expensive, and the legal process that followed was, accordingly, very slow and not complete within any timeline this story is concerned with. Dale Pruitt was not charged. That decision was not made quickly or without debate. The federal prosecutors looked at 17 years of inaction and weighed it against the active cooperation at the moment it mattered, and weighed that against the practical reality that Pruitt's testimony was valuable and his criminal exposure was genuinely limited to failure to report rather than active participation. They cut an immunity agreement. Pruitt resigned from the department the same day he signed it, which nobody required him to do and which he did anyway. He took a job with the State Forestry Service the following spring. It paid less and required more time outdoors in bad weather, and he had told the interviewer, when asked why he wanted the position, that he'd spent a long time working inside a building and thought it was time to work outside. The interviewer had accepted this without further inquiry. The memory card's contents were, as Lena had said, devastating. 14 gigabytes is not a large file by contemporary standards, but when 14 gigabytes contains financial records, cross-referencing county budget, anomalies against weapons procurement invoices, encrypted communications establishing the specific chain of custody for illegally modified hardware, transport schedules with coordinates and escort designations, and 6 audio recordings, including one in which Sheriff Harlan Voss explicitly discussed engineering a traffic accident for a state investigator. It constitutes what the lead federal prosecutor later described in her pretrial briefing as one of the most complete documentary records of systematic law enforcement corruption she had encountered in 21 years of practice. The trial, Voss's trial, the main event, would take another 8 months to reach a courtroom. Federal cases of this complexity moved at their own pace and could not be hurried without creating appellate vulnerabilities that the defense was already mapping carefully. But the pretrial detention was sustained, the bail application denied on flight risk grounds, and Harlan Voss spent those 8 months in federal holding, in a facility 140 miles from Frostfang County, where his name had been on a courthouse wall for 11 years and was removed by county order before the snow had fully melted in spring. The weapons shipment that had been 4 days out was intercepted. That piece of the operation was coordinated by federal agents working from the transport schedules on the card, and it was not clean or simple. It required coordination across 3 county jurisdictions and involved a tense standoff at a secondary location that ended without casualties but generated its own subsequent legal proceedings. The shipment itself was substantial, over 300 units of illegally modified hardware, including suppressors, receivers, and components with no legal civilian pathway, destined for buyers whose identities were established through the financial records and who were subsequently the subject of their own federal attention. Elias learned about the shipment from Carver, who called him on a satellite phone 3 weeks after December 14th to give him what she called a status update and what he understood as something closer to a courtesy that she didn't owe him and had provided anyway. "The shipment location," he said. "Was it in the county?" "No, outside county lines. That was deliberate. Voss kept the physical storage outside his own jurisdiction to create legal distance. Smart. Not smart enough." A pause. "Mercer. The notation I mentioned. Yes. It's been accessed." Another pause. "By someone in the Pentagon with a 2-stars staff credentials." He was quiet for a moment. "I see," he said. "I don't know what happens next with that. That's genuinely not in my lane." Her voice was careful. "But I wanted you to know it had been accessed." He thanked her. She said it wasn't necessary, but she said it in the tone of someone who was willing to accept it anyway. They ended the call. He sat with that for 3 days before anything came of it. On the 4th day, a letter arrived. Physical mail, which was delivered to the cabin via the rural route carrier who came up the mountain access road twice a week, in a postal vehicle that was too small for the terrain and made it anyway through a combination of mechanical stubbornness and driver commitment. The letter was from the Naval Special Warfare Command Administrative Review Board. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph noted that new information had come to light in connection with his case. The second paragraph informed him that his administrative separation review had been formally reopened under Article 69 of the Uniform Code. The third paragraph told him that pending the completion of that review, his service record had been provisionally cleared of the gray wall notation. He read it 3 times. Not because he didn't understand it, he understood it immediately, but because understanding something and believing it were different activities, and sometimes the second one took longer than the first. He set the letter on the table, looked at the coffee stain. Ghost put his chin on Elias's knee and looked up at him with those amber eyes that were always doing math and occasionally arrived at the right answer without any help. Elias put his hand on the dog's head. Outside, the mountains were white and still and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in them, which was their nature and always had been. The storm was long gone. The sky above the ridgeline was a color that had no name except winter afternoon blue, the kind that appears for maybe 3 hours on clear days in December and January before the temperature drop at dusk flattens it back to gray. He looked at that sky for a while. Lena came back to this cabin on a Saturday in late January. She drove herself up in a personal vehicle, which Elias noted because the drive required nerve and local knowledge, and she'd navigated it without incident, which told him the ribs had healed enough that she trusted herself behind a wheel in mountain conditions. She parked where the vehicles had parked on December 14th and sat in the car for a moment before getting out, which he saw from the window and pretended he hadn't. She looked better, not recovered. The way she moved still had a slight accommodation in it, a protective hold around her left side that would probably take another month or 2 to fully release. But the color was back in her face, and the exhaustion that had been so deep it was structural seemed to have lifted enough to show the person underneath it. He had coffee ready because he'd heard the car on the road, and it wasn't a difficult inference. She came in through the door and stood for a moment in the warmth of the cabin, looking at it, at the patched window frames where the foam pads had been, at the table where the federal documentation station had been, at the cot in the corner that looked exactly as it had before any of this. Ghost went to her immediately. She crouched and let him greet her, both hands in the fur at his neck, and the dog pressed his whole body against her with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been thinking about her since December. "Hi, Ghost," she said. Her voice was different around the dog, less managed. "Coffee," Elias said. "Please." She sat at the table. He sat across from her. The same positions as the interview with Carver, different energy entirely. "How are the ribs?" he said. "Better. Still complain when it's cold." She wrapped her hands around the mug, which is constantly up here. "Yes." She looked around the cabin again, out the window at the white ridge line, back at him. "You got the letter," she said. He looked at her. "Carver told me," Lena said. "She calls occasionally to update me on the case." A pause. "And other things, apparently." "The review was reopened," he said. "I know." She held his gaze. "Are you going to go?" "To the review board?" "To whatever comes after the review board." He considered this. It was a question he'd been asking himself for 3 weeks without arriving at a clean answer, which was new for him. Most of the decisions in his life had been simple, even the hard ones. The simplicity coming not from the absence of difficulty, but from the clarity of what mattered. This decision was different because it wasn't clear what the right answer was, only that there was one and he had to find it. "I don't know," he said. She nodded slowly. "That's probably the most honest answer. What do you think I should do?" She looked at him with an expression that was slightly surprised he'd asked. Then she looked at her coffee. "I think you built a very good hiding place," she said. "And I think hiding was the right thing for a while. And I think December 14th was you finding out that you were done hiding, even if you didn't decide to be done." He looked at the window, at the ridgeline. "The mountains are still here," he said. "They will be," she said. "They're mountains." Ghost padded over and lay down across both their feet, which was physically inconvenient for everyone involved, and which neither of them mentioned. She told him about the case, about the trial preparation and the depositions she'd given, and the way the federal prosecutor's team worked, which was thorough and patient and occasionally maddening in the way that all institutional processes were maddening when you knew the answer already and had to wait for the institution to arrive at it by its own route. She told him about the 6 recordings and what the forensic audio team had been able to establish about them: dates, locations, voice identification. She told him that the second recording, the one she hadn't fully described on December 14th, contained not just Voss discussing the investigator, but Voss and 2 other voices discussing 3 additional staged accidents over the previous 4 years, 2 of which had been logged as fatalities in the county records. 3 people who were dead whose deaths had explanations that were lies. Elias looked at the table when she said that. The coffee stain. "Were they found?" he asked. "The families were notified in January," she said. "I was in the room for one of those notifications." She stopped. Her hands tightened on the mug. "I don't have anything to say about that. It was very hard." He didn't push. They were quiet for a moment. "Pruitt testified," she said. "His deposition went 4 hours. He named everyone he could, and a few he wasn't sure about, and the distinction was clear in the transcript, which the prosecutor said was one of the more credible cooperation testimonies she'd seen." A pause. "He's not a bad man." "No," Elias said. "He was a man who made a long series of comfortable choices until he was in so deep that the next choice was whether to keep being comfortable or be something else." She looked at him. "Not an unusual story." "No," he said again. She left at 3 in the afternoon because the light went fast in January and the road off the mountain needed daylight. She stood at the door in her coat and looked at him the same way she'd looked at the cabin when she'd arrived, trying to see all of it at once, store it clearly. "Elias," she said. "Yeah. What you did that morning, going out to the station in those conditions, with those men in the field." She stopped, tried again. "You didn't have to do any of it. You could have handed me blankets and called for help and waited for it, and that would have been a reasonable and defensible response to finding a stranger in a ravine." "It would have been," he agreed, "but you didn't." "No." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm trying to figure out how to say thank you for that in a way that's proportionate." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." A pause. "I want to." He looked at her. At the dried blood that had been on her face 12 days ago and was not there now, and at the woman who had been there through all of it, both the bleeding and the aftermath, both the breaking and the not breaking. She was still in the uniform, he noticed. She'd come back to work. He wasn't sure when that had happened, but it didn't surprise him. "You built the case," he said, "alone, over months, without backup, in a department that was being used against you. You carried it out of there and you protected it even after your cruiser went off a cliff. He paused. I got it the last mile. That's different. She looked at him steadily. Teamwork, then. He almost smiled. Something like that. She went. He watched the car negotiate the first switchback and disappear behind the tree line, and then he turned back to the cabin, which was warm and quiet and still smelled faintly of the Federal Documentation Station's printer, which had been running most of December 14th afternoon. The review board convened in February. Elias drove down from the mountain on a Tuesday morning before light, Ghost in the back seat, the truck loaded with 3 days' worth of supplies, because he didn't know how long the proceedings would take, and he wasn't going to be caught flat-footed on logistics. The drive to the Naval Administrative Facility took most of the day. He arrived at the edge of the city in late afternoon and checked into a motel on the service road near the base, the kind of place where the ice machine was in the parking lot and the TV remote was attached to the table with a wire, and he ate from the gas station across the street because he hadn't thought to look for a restaurant and he didn't particularly care. Ghost slept on the second bed with the solemnity of a dog who understood that something significant was happening and was reserving his energy accordingly. The board convened at 0900. There were 3 members, a captain, a commander, and a civilian attorney from the DoD's Legal Counsel Office. The room was institutional and small, with a rectangular table and a window that looked out at a parking structure, and the overhead lights had the specific quality of fluorescence that was slightly worse than just not having lights. Elias had been in worse rooms for worse purposes, and he sat in the single chair on the far side of the table and looked at the 3 people who were about to determine something significant and didn't perform anything in particular. The captain led it. He was 60, or close to it, with the administrative bearing of someone who had spent more of his career in rooms than in the field, which Elias didn't hold against him. The questioning was thorough. It covered Greywall in full. The original planning, Elias's descent, the operation itself, the immediate aftermath, the review that had followed. The commander asked most of the technical questions about the intelligence assessment. The civilian attorney focused on procedure. 3 hours in, the captain set down his pen. Mercer, he said. The new information. The source debrief from 6 weeks post-Greywall. When you were first notified of its existence, what was your reaction? Elias thought about the moment at the kitchen table with Carver across from him. I was surprised it hadn't been found earlier, he said. And I wasn't. Meaning? Meaning the original review had a conclusion it was working toward, and evidence that complicated that conclusion was not aggressively sought. Which is a human tendency. I'm not accusing anyone of deliberate misconduct. He paused. Just ordinary motivated reasoning. The captain looked at him for a moment. You're being generous, the commander said. I'm being accurate, Elias said. Generous would be pretending it doesn't happen. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. He waited in a hallway that smelled of cleaning product and old carpet, with a cup of coffee from a machine that was technically coffee, in the sense that it was liquid and warm and had started as a coffee-related agricultural product at some point. When they called him back in, the captain was standing. Petty Officer Mercer, he said. He used the rank. The one from before the separation. This board finds that the Greywall notation in your service record was made without full access to available intelligence materials that were directly relevant to the findings of the original review board, and that this constitutes a material procedural deficiency under the provisions of Article 69. He looked at the paper in front of him, then back at Elias. Effective today, the notation is expunged. Your record is cleared. Elias stood. He'd thought about this moment for 3 years. Not constantly. There were months when he'd barely thought about it at all, when the cabin and the mountains had been sufficient and the world below the ridgeline had felt sufficiently remote that his relationship to it could be managed at a distance. But the moment had been there, in the background, the way certain sounds are inaudible until the room gets quiet enough. He'd expected to feel something large when it happened. What he felt was quieter than that. A specific settling, like a weight that had been subtly off balance for a long time finally finding its center. Not triumph, not vindication in the cinematic sense, just the factual, physical sense of something being corrected, a thing that was wrong becoming right, which was simpler and less dramatic than the stories people told about such things. Thank you, he said. He drove back up the mountain on Thursday. Spring would come in another 8 weeks or so, late in the frost fangs, but certain. The snow would start pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, revealing the dark earth underneath, the first impossible green things pushing through before the last frost had a chance to object. The access road would clear, the world below would resume its proximity. He thought about what Lena had said, about the hiding place, about being done with it, even before deciding to be done. He turned onto the fire access road that led up to the cabin and shifted into four-wheel drive and felt the tires find their grip on the packed snow and drove the last 3 miles in the low, steady way you drive when the terrain demands your full attention, and the terrain always does. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it. The wood stove had held overnight on its slow burn, and the interior was cool but not cold, and Ghost went through the door first and did his perimeter check of every corner with the thoroughness of a professional who didn't take his employer's word for anything. Elias put his pack down. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at it. At the log walls, dark and solid and patient. At the cot where Lena had lain. At the table where Carver had set her recorder. At the window where the morning of December 14th had started with Ghost going rigid at the glass and the thin black line of wrong smoke rising through the white. He went to the table and sat down, put both hands flat on the wood. He didn't know yet what came next. That was honest. The cleared record opened a door he'd thought was sealed, and what was on the other side of it was not yet visible. It might be a return to some form of service. It might be something else entirely. The world was large and had a significant number of problems that required people who understood how to move through them, and he was still, at 41, more capable of that than most. Or it might be that the mountain was where he was supposed to be, and the difference was that he'd be here by choice rather than by retreat, which was a different thing. He didn't need to know today. Ghost settled under the table and put his chin on Elias's boot, which was where the dog had put his chin on 100 mornings in this chair. The fire ticked as the fresh split of pine Elias had loaded found its temperature. Outside, the ridgeline held the last of the afternoon light in the specific way it held it in late winter, the sun getting low early and painting the snow a color that was almost orange before the blue shadows came up from the valley and swallowed everything. He looked at it through the window. Then he got up and made coffee and sat back down and looked at the mountain and let it be what it was, which was very large and very old and entirely uninterested in whether any of this had been fair. The truth had survived. That was the accounting that mattered. Not the comfort of the people who had tried to bury it, not the convenience of the institution that had taken the easier path, not the silence of a mountain that didn't care either way. Just the fact of it, still standing, still verifiable, still capable of doing its work in the world. That was enough. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to start with. Yeah. The most dangerous thing a person can do is see something that others have decided not to see. And the bravest thing is to refuse to look away from it, even when looking away would cost you nothing, and looking closer costs you everything.